My name is James Harlow. I'm a park ranger stationed in one of the most remote places in the country, the Boundary Waters Canoe Area in northern Minnesota. It's quiet here, surrounded by endless forests, crystal clear lakes, and the kind of silence that feels like it could swallow you whole. That's exactly why I came here. After losing my wife to illness a few years ago, I needed the solitude. I needed the space to breathe, or maybe just to forget. This morning started like any other. The mist hung low over the water as I walked along the shoreline, my boots crunching softly against the pebbles. The air smelled fresh, clean, untouched by the chaos of the world outside these woods. For a moment, I felt at peace. But something was off today. The forest was too quiet. No birds singing, no squirrels darting between trees. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. As I walked further along the shore, I noticed something strange. Footprints. They were long and narrow, almost unnatural looking, and they seemed to just stop halfway through their trail, as if whoever or whatever made them had vanished into thin air. I crouched down to get a closer look, brushing my fingers over the damp earth. The shape wasn't like any animal I'd seen before, and I've seen plenty in my years out here. My gut told me something wasn't right, but I shook it off and kept walking. Later that morning, I checked the weather report on my radio. It warned of an unseasonable cold front moving in. A strange thing for June, but around here the weather can be unpredictable. Still, as I looked out at the still lake and the towering pines around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from deep within those trees. The day took a strange turn, not long after I returned to the ranger station. Around noon, a call came through on the radio. It was a garbled message, but I caught enough to understand 2 hikers were reported missing in the northern quadrant of the park. Their families hadn't heard from them in days, and their car was still parked at the trailhead. Missing hikers weren't unheard of, but something about this felt different. I grabbed my pack and set out toward their last known location. The northern quadrant was dense, wild, and rarely visited. The trail was overgrown in places, and the deeper I went, the colder it seemed to get. By the time I reached their campsite, I could see my breath in the air. In June, the campsite itself was eerie. A pot of food still sat over a smoldering fire, as if they'd left in a hurry. Their tent was half-zipped, with a sleeping bag tossed carelessly inside. But no sign of the hikers. I started searching the area, and soon found something that made my stomach twist, a small notebook lying near the fire pit. Flipping through it, I saw entries from one of the hikers. At first, it was just normal stuff. Descriptions of the trails, how beautiful the forest was. But then toward the end, things got unsettling. June 5th. We keep hearing whispers at night. Thought it was just wind at first, but it sounds like voices, too faint to make out. June 6th. Something's watching us. I can feel it. Every time I look into the trees, there's nothing there, but I know we're not alone. The last entry sent a chill down my spine. It's closer now. We're leaving first thing in the morning, but they hadn't left. Something had stopped them. As I packed up their belongings to take back with me, my compass started spinning wildly in my hand. No matter which way I turned, it wouldn't settle on north. Then my radio crackled to life, but instead of a voice, all I heard was static mixed with faint whispers that didn't make sense. By now, the temperature had dropped even more. Frost clung to the edges of leaves and grass around me like winter had crept in early. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't abandon those hikers without answers. I took one last look around, before heading back to report what I'd found. That's when I noticed something else. Those same strange footprints from earlier, leading straight into the forest. The footprints bothered me. They weren't like anything I'd seen before, and the way they disappeared mid-track made my skin crawl. I radioed for backup as soon as I got back to the station. Ranger Michael Peterson was the closest to my area, and he arrived later that afternoon. Peterson was younger than me, maybe in his late 20s, and full of energy. He didn't seem too concerned about the strange details I shared, at least not at first. We set out together the next morning to search deeper into the northern quadrant. The plan was simple. follow the trail from the campsite and see if we could find any signs of the hikers. As we hiked, Peterson joked about how people always get spooked in the woods and how it was probably just a bear that scared them off. I wanted to believe him, but something didn't sit right with me. About an hour into our hike, we found claw marks on several trees. They were high up, far higher than any bear could reach, and they were deep, like something had raked through the bark with incredible force. Peterson stopped joking after that. Not long after, we stumbled upon a deer carcass. It was frozen solid, despite the warm summer air, and half-eaten. The smell of rot hit us like a wall, making it hard to breathe. Peterson muttered something under his breath, but I didn't catch it. We both knew this wasn't normal. Later that day, we visited a nearby Ojibwe village to ask if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual. An elder named Joseph agreed to speak with us. He listened quietly as we described what we'd found: the claw marks, the footprints, the frost, and when we finished, he looked at us with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You're dealing with something old," he said finally. "Something that doesn't belong here anymore." When we asked him what he meant, he told us about the Wendigo, a creature from their legends that preyed on people during times of desperation. He said it could mimic voices and lure people into the woods, and wherever it went, unnatural cold followed. Peterson dismissed it as superstition, but I couldn't shake Joseph's words. That night, back at camp, I started hearing things. At first, it was faint, a voice calling my name from somewhere in the trees. But then it grew louder, clearer. It was my wife's voice. I froze in place, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. She sounded so real, so close, but she couldn't be here. She was gone. I stayed inside my cabin all night, gripping her locket tightly in my hand and trying not to listen to her voice calling me from the darkness outside. The next morning, Peterson was gone. I woke up early, hoping to shake off the strange events of the night before, but when I stepped outside, his tent was empty. His gear was still there, his flashlight, his pack, but there was no sign of him. I called out his name, my voice echoing through the trees, but only silence answered me. I found his flashlight about 100 yards from camp, lying in a clearing surrounded by those same strange footprints. They circled around in an almost deliberate pattern before disappearing into the forest. My stomach churned. Peterson wouldn't have wandered off without telling me. He wasn't that careless. I followed the trail as far as I could, but it didn't take long for the footprints to vanish again. The forest felt wrong, like it was holding its breath. The air was colder now, biting at my face and hands even though the sun was shining above. As I searched, I began noticing more strange things. Trees with their bark stripped in perfect spirals, stretching for miles. Patches of frost clinging to leaves and branches that should have been thawed by the morning sun. And then there was the jacket, Peterson's jacket, hanging from a tree branch 20 feet up, torn and bloody. I tried to radio for help, but all I got was static. Then, through the static, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Peterson's voice. "Help me," it said, faint and distorted. "James, help me." It didn't sound quite right, like someone trying to imitate him, but not getting it exactly right. Still, I couldn't ignore it. I followed the sound deeper into the woods, my rifle gripped tightly in my hands. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a glimpse, a tall, gaunt figure moving between the trees, faster than anything humanly possible. It was too far away to make out details, but its movements were wrong, jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on tangled strings. My heart raced as I raised my rifle and shouted into the trees. "Peterson, is that you?" No answer. Just the sound of branches snapping in the distance. By now, I knew this wasn't just a missing person case anymore. Something else was out here with us. Something dangerous. When I returned to camp that evening, everything felt different. The air was heavy with tension, and shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should have. That night, as I sat in my cabin trying to make sense of it all, I heard her voice again, my wife's voice. This time it wasn't calling me from outside, it came from right behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly knocked over the chair. My heart was pounding, and my hands were shaking as I gripped the rifle. but there was nothing there. Just the empty cabin, dimly lit by the glow of the lantern on the table. James. Her voice came again, soft and familiar, like she was standing just outside the door. Please, come to me. I froze. It sounded exactly like her. My wife, Emily. The way she used to say my name, the way her voice would catch when she was upset, but it couldn't be real. She was gone. I knew that. I'd held her hand in the hospital when she took her last breath. James, why won't you come? Her voice cracked, like she was crying now. I clenched my fists, trying to block it out. You're not real, I whispered to myself. You're not real, but it didn't stop. The whispers grew louder, more desperate, until they filled the cabin, coming from every direction. I grabbed Emily's locket from around my neck and held it tightly in my hand, closing my eyes and forcing myself to breathe. Eventually, the whispers faded, leaving only silence. The next morning, I went back to see Joseph, the Ojibwe elder. I told him everything, the voices, the footprints, Peterson's disappearance. He listened quietly, his face grim. You've seen it, he said when I finished. I nodded slowly. I think so. Or maybe it saw me. Joseph reached into his pocket and pulled out a small amulet made of bone and leather. He handed it to me without a word. What is this? I asked. It will protect you, he said simply. Then he leaned closer and added in a low voice, the Wendigo doesn't just kill, it corrupts. It preys on your mind, your memories. It will use what you love most against you. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Emily's voice wasn't just a coincidence, it was deliberate. The creature knew how to get inside my head. Before I left, Joseph gave me instructions for a ritual that could weaken the Wendigo symbols to carve into the trees and a chant to recite if I faced it again. He warned me it wouldn't be easy, and that I might not survive. As I walked back to camp with the amulet in my pocket, I couldn't shake one thought. If this thing could use Emily's voice, what else could it do? I couldn't sit still anymore. Peterson was still out there, or at least some part of him was, and I wasn't going to let this thing take another person without a fight. I packed my gear, grabbed the amulet Joseph had given me, and set out toward the northern quadrant again. This time, I didn't care about following trails or playing it safe. I was going to find answers, no matter what it took. The deeper I went into the forest, the colder it got. Frost clung to the trees, and thin sheets of ice began forming on puddles along the trail. It didn't make sense. It was supposed to be summer. But this wasn't natural. It felt like the forest itself was changing, bending under the weight of something ancient and wrong. By midday, I stumbled upon a series of caves hidden behind a ridge. They weren't marked on any map I'd seen, and judging by the overgrowth around them, they hadn't been visited in years, maybe decades. Something about them felt heavy, like the air around them was thicker than it should have been. Inside one of the caves, I found pictographs carved into the stone walls, old symbols that told a story. They showed a creature with antlers towering over people, its hands stretched out as if it were pulling them toward it. Below that were images of men performing rituals, chanting, carving symbols into trees, and sealing something away. I didn't need Joseph to tell me what it meant. This wasn't just a cave, it was where they had trapped the Wendigo before. As I explored deeper into the caves, I found something that stopped me cold. Human remains, bones hung from the walls like decorations, tied together with strips of leather and bark. Some were old, so old they crumbled at my touch, but others looked fresh. I wasn't tracking the Wendigo anymore. It was tracking me. The air grew colder as I moved further in, my breath visible in front of me like smoke. Then I heard it. Peterson's voice. James, help me. It echoed through the cave, faint and broken like a bad radio signal. My grip tightened on my rifle as I followed the sound deeper into the darkness. James, please. I turned a corner and froze. There he was, or what was left of him. Peterson sat slumped against the wall, his skin pale and frost-bitten, his eyes wide with terror. But his voice wasn't coming from his mouth. I stood there, frozen, staring at Peterson. His lips weren't moving, but his voice still echoed through the cave. James, help me. It was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. His body looked lifeless. His skin stretched tight over his bones like he hadn't eaten in weeks. But his eyes, they were wide open, darting around in panic. Peterson, I whispered, my voice trembling. His head jerked up suddenly, and for a moment, I thought he recognized me. But then his mouth opened unnaturally wide, too wide, and a sound came out that wasn't human. It was a deep, guttural growl that echoed off the cave walls and sent chills down my spine. And then I saw it. Something moved in the shadows behind him, tall and impossibly thin, with glowing eyes that burned like embers. It stepped forward slowly, its antlers scraping against the cave ceiling. Its body was skeletal, its skin stretched tight over its frame like Peterson's, but its movements were sharp and jerky, as if it didn't belong in this world. The Wendigo. I raised my rifle and fired without thinking. The shot echoed through the cave, and for a moment, everything went still. Then it let out a scream, a high-pitched wail that made my ears ring and my stomach churn. Black ichor dripped from its side where the bullet had hit, but it didn't slow down. Instead, it lunged toward me with unnatural speed. I scrambled backward, barely dodging its claws as they raked through the air inches from my face. The amulet Joseph had given me burned hot against my chest as I clutched it tightly in one hand and fired another shot with the other. This time, the creature staggered back, snarling. But it wasn't retreating, it was toying with me. I knew then that I couldn't kill it, not with bullets. My only chance was to get out of there alive and figure out how to stop it for good. I ran. I didn't think. I didn't look back. I just ran. My boots pounded against the rocky floor of the cave as the Wendigo's screeches echoed behind me. The air was so cold it burned my lungs, and every breath felt like dragging ice through my chest. My flashlight flickered, its beam barely cutting through the suffocating darkness. When I finally burst out of the cave into the open forest, I didn't stop. I kept running until my legs gave out and I collapsed against a tree, gasping for air. The forest was eerily quiet again, but I knew it wasn't over. The Wendigo wasn't going to let me go that easily. When I made it back to camp, it was destroyed. The tents were shredded, supplies scattered everywhere, and then I saw him. Thomas Jenkins, the radio operator who had arrived earlier that day to help coordinate the search. He was sitting in his chair by the radio, completely still. "Jenkins?" I called out, my voice shaky. He didn't respond. As I got closer, I saw why. His body was frozen solid, his face twisted in terror. Frost clung to his skin and clothes, and his eyes stared blankly into nothingness. The radio beside him crackled faintly with static. I stumbled back, my mind racing. This thing wasn't just hunting us, it was tearing through everything in its path. I remembered Joseph's words about the ritual and grabbed my knife from my pack. With shaking hands, I began carving the protective symbols he'd taught me into the trees around what was left of the camp. As I worked, I recited the chant under my breath, over and over again like a prayer. But then I heard it again, Emily's voice. "James, why are you doing this? Don't you love me?" I froze, my knife slipping from my hand. The voice was so clear, so real, but I knew better now. It wasn't her. It was the Wendigo. I didn't have time to think. The voice was getting louder, circling me, coming from every direction. "James, come to me. I need you." It was Emily's voice, but I forced myself to keep carving the symbols into the trees. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the knife, but I couldn't stop. If I stopped, it would win. The frost spread quickly, crawling up the trunks of the trees and turning the ground beneath me into ice. The Wendigo was close. I could feel it watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. My breath came out in short, visible bursts as I whispered Joseph's chant over and over again. The amulet around my neck felt hot against my skin, almost burning, but I held onto it like it was the only thing keeping me alive. And then I saw Peterson. He stumbled out of the shadows, his body twisted and wrong, His skin was pale and stretched tight over his bones, and his eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. He wasn't human anymore. Not fully, but there was still something in him that looked like the man I'd known. "James," he rasped, his voice broken and weak. "It's too late for me." I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. "No, we can stop this." He smiled faintly, a sad, broken smile, and then he stepped closer. "You have to finish it," he said, "but you can't save me." Before I could respond, the Wendigo appeared behind him. It moved so fast, I barely had time to react. Its antlers scraped against the trees as it lunged toward me, its glowing eyes locked onto mine. I fired my rifle again and again, but it didn't slow down. Peterson turned to face it and let out a guttural scream before throwing himself at the creature. "Do it now," he shouted as they collided. I didn't hesitate. With trembling hands, I lit the fire I'd prepared earlier and hurled it toward the cave entrance. Flames roared to life, spreading quickly through the dry brush and forcing the Wendigo back toward the cave. Peterson fought with everything he had, but he was no match for the creature's strength. As the fire grew hotter and brighter, he turned to look at me one last time. "Seal it," he said softly. I recited Joseph's chant one final time as I carved the last symbol into a nearby tree. The Wendigo let out a deafening scream as the flames consumed it, and then everything went still. Peterson was gone. The forest was quiet again. The frost melted and the air warmed as the fire burned itself out. But the silence wasn't comforting. It felt hollow, like something had been taken from this place. I stood there for a long time, staring at the cave entrance I'd sealed with the symbols Joseph had taught me. The Wendigo was trapped, but the cost was too high. I searched for Peterson, hoping against hope that he'd somehow survived. But all I found were ashes and black ichor staining the ground where he'd made his final stand. He'd sacrificed himself to give me a chance to stop it, and I wasn't sure I'd ever forgive myself for letting him go. When I returned to the ranger station, everything felt different. The camp was destroyed, Jenkins was gone, and I was alone again. The official report listed the incident as a wildlife attack and forest fire, but I knew better. No one would believe the truth. Not really. Months later, after recovering in the hospital, I returned to the Boundary Waters one last time. The forest had started to heal, but something still felt wrong. When I visited the cave, I found it open again, broken apart by new logging operations in the area. That night, as I sat in my cabin staring at Emily's locket, frost began forming on the windows, and then I heard her voice. "James, come to me." My name is Nathan Holbrook, and I've spent most of my life in the White Mountain National Forest. It's more than just a job to me. It's home. I'm a third-generation ranger, just like my father and grandfather before me. The forest is in my blood, and I know every trail, every sound, and every shift in the wind like the back of my hand. But lately, something feels off. It started with small things. The deer weren't moving through their usual paths, and birds were flying south weeks earlier than they should. Even the air felt different, heavier somehow. At first, I thought it was just me being overly sensitive. After all, it had been a rough year. My wife passed away from cancer 6 months ago, and I'd just come back to work after taking time off to care for her. Now it's just me and my 16-year-old daughter Lily. She's been staying with me at the ranger station while I try to piece our lives back together. One crisp autumn morning, while making my rounds, I stumbled across something strange. A perfect circle of dead vegetation deep in the woods. The grass inside the circle was brittle and gray, crumbling under my boots like ash. But what really caught my attention was the center of the circle. There were tiny plants sprouting there, vines twisting unnaturally fast, as if they were alive and trying to reach for something. I knelt down to get a closer look when a chill ran up my spine. I don't scare easily. I've faced wild animals and harsh storms, but this felt different. It felt wrong. That night, Lily woke up screaming from a nightmare. She couldn't explain it clearly, but she kept saying she was being chased by something huge with glowing eyes. I held her close and told her it was just a bad dream, but deep down I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that it was connected to what I'd seen earlier. The next day at the station, an old friend of mine, Walter Jenkins, dropped by for coffee. Walter's been a ranger here even longer than I have. He's one of those guys who has a story for everything. When I mentioned the dead circle and Lily's nightmare, his face went pale. "I've seen that before," he said quietly. 1985, same time of year, animals acting strange, people having nightmare, and then folks started disappearing. Disappearing, I asked, leaning forward. Walter nodded grimly. "The logs are still in storage if you want to read them yourself. But let me tell you this, whatever's out there isn't natural." I didn't know what to say to that. Walter wasn't one for tall tales or exaggeration, which made his words hit harder. That evening, as Lily and I sat by the fire in our small cabin near the station, she asked me something that sent a shiver down my spine. "Dad," she said softly, "do you think there's something out there, something watching us?" I forced a smile and told her not to worry, that everything would be fine. But as I stared into the flickering flames that night, I couldn't help but feel like we were being pulled into something far bigger than we could understand. The next few days were unsettling, to say the least. Lily kept having nightmares, and they were getting worse. She'd wake up in the middle of the night, gasping for air, her face pale and drenched in sweat. She said she dreamed of running through the forest, but no matter how fast she ran, something was always right behind her, something huge, with glowing amber eyes. I tried to comfort her, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just bad dreams. One night, I woke up to the sound of the cabin door creaking open. My heart jumped into my throat as I scrambled out of bed and ran to check on Lily. Her room was empty. The bed was still warm, but she was gone. I grabbed my flashlight and bolted outside, calling her name. "Lily, Lily!" My voice echoed through the trees, but there was no answer. The forest was eerily quiet, except for the crunch of leaves under my boots. Then I saw her. She was standing in the middle of a clearing about 50 yards away, staring at something on the ground. Her hair was messy, her pajamas were damp from the dew, and she looked lost, like she wasn't really there. I ran to her and shook her gently. "Lily, what are you doing out here?" She blinked a few times as if waking up from a dream. "I don't know," she whispered. "Wall, the Deadingham, I don't remember coming here." I shined my flashlight down at what she'd been staring at, a large stone marker sticking out of the ground. It looked ancient, covered in moss and strange carvings that I didn't recognize. The air around it felt heavy, almost like it was pressing down on us. "Come on," I said firmly, wrapping my arm around her shoulder and leading her back to the cabin. "You're safe now." But when we got inside and I turned on the light, I noticed something strange on her wrist, a faint mark that hadn't been there before. It looked like a birthmark or a scar, but it had an odd shape, almost like an intricate symbol. "What's that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. She looked down at it and frowned. "I don't know," she said softly. "It doesn't hurt." The next day I took Lily into town to visit Martha Kingsley, an herbalist who's lived here for decades. Martha knows more about this forest than anyone else. Its plants, its history, its secrets. When Martha saw Lily's wrist, her face darkened. She traced the mark gently with her finger and muttered something under her breath. "What is it?" I asked. Martha hesitated before answering. "It's called the huntsman's mark," she said quietly. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about it when I was little." "What kind of stories?" I pressed. Martha glanced at Lily before continuing. "Every 7 years during the harvest moon, people go missing in these woods. They're chosen by something ancient, something that's been here long before us." I felt a chill run down my spine as she spoke. "The mark means she's been chosen," Martha added softly. I refused to believe it. This couldn't be real. But deep down I knew there was truth in Martha's words. The strange behavior in the forest, Lily's nightmares, Walter's stories, it all seemed connected. That evening, while Lily rested in her room, I couldn't stop thinking about that stone marker in the clearing. So after dinner, I grabbed my flashlight and headed back out into the woods alone. When I reached the marker again, I noticed something new, more symbols carved into nearby trees and rocks that hadn't been visible before. It was like they'd been uncovered by erosion or time itself. As I crouched down to inspect one of them more closely, I felt a sudden gust of wind whip through the clearing. The trees rustled violently, even though there wasn't supposed to be any storm tonight. And then, for just a moment, I thought I heard footsteps behind me. The next morning, I couldn't shake what had happened in the clearing. The symbols, the strange wind, and those footsteps, something was out there. Something I couldn't explain. I decided it was time to dig deeper. I started with the old ranger logs that Walter had mentioned. After breakfast, I left Lily at the cabin with strict instructions to stay inside and drove to the station's archives. The logbooks were dusty and worn, their pages yellowed with age. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for, entries from 1985. The first few pages were routine, wildlife sightings, weather reports, but then I found a section that made my stomach twist. It described strange occurrences in the forest, dead patches of vegetation, animals behaving erratically, and people reporting nightmares about being hunted, just like now. Then came the part that stopped me cold. There were names listed, people who had gone missing during that time. Most of them were teenagers, and next to their names was a note, asterisk marked, asterisk. I slammed the book shut, my hands trembling. This wasn't just some old legend or campfire, it was real, and it was happening again. I needed answers, so I reached out to someone who might have them. Gabriel Whitefeather, a tribal historian who lived on the edge of town. Gabriel's family had lived in this area long before the settlers arrived, and he knew more about these woods than anyone else. When I showed him a sketch of the symbol from Lily's wrist, his expression turned serious. "This is old," he said after a long pause. "Very old. What does it mean?" I asked. Gabriel leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant as if searching through memories. "My people have stories about a spirit that lives in these mountains," he said slowly. "A hunter, a guardian of the forest. But it's not like the spirits we honor, it's something darker." He explained that centuries ago, when settlers first arrived in this region, they disrupted the balance of the land. To survive harsh winters and failing crops, some of them made a pact with this spirit, a deal to protect their settlement in exchange for sacrifices. The spirit became bound to this place, Gabriel continued. But over time the pact weakened. Now it hunts freely during the harvest moon every 7 years. I felt a knot tighten in my chest as he spoke. "And the mark?" I asked. Gabriel nodded grimly. "It chooses its prey ahead of time," he said. "Once marked, there's no escaping it." I left Gabriel's house with more questions than answers and a growing sense of dread. If what he said was true, then Lily and others like her were in danger. That night, back at the cabin, Lily's nightmares took a terrifying turn. She woke up screaming again, but this time she was shaking uncontrollably and crying so hard she could barely breathe. When I finally calmed her down enough to speak, she described something that sent chills down my spine. "I saw it," she whispered through tears. "The thing chasing me, it wasn't human." "What did it look like?" I asked gently. She hesitated before answering. "It was tall, taller than any person I've ever seen. It had antlers like a deer but bigger, sharper, and its eyes, they glowed like fire." I held her close as she sobbed into my chest, trying to hide my own fear. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just in her dreams anymore. It was real. The next day, while Lily rested at home, I went back into the forest to search for more clues. Deep in the woods, near another clearing, I found something chilling. More stone markers arranged in a rough circle around a tree that looked older than anything else in the area. The bark of the tree was covered in deep scratches, claw marks, and at its base was something even stranger. Dark amber-colored resin seeping from cracks in the trunk. The smell was sharp and earthy, but also faintly metallic. As I crouched down to examine it closer, I felt that same heavy presence from before, the feeling of being watched. I stood up slowly and scanned the trees around me with my flashlight, even though it was still daylight. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet again. No bird song, no rustling leaves, just silence. And then, just for a second, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow darted between two trees far ahead of me, too fast to be an animal but too large to be human. My heart pounded as I gripped my flashlight tighter and took a step back toward the trail. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to let us go easily. The days that followed felt like a ticking clock, each moment heavier than the last. I couldn't stop thinking about what Gabriel had told me, about the pact and the spirit bound to these woods. The harvest moon was only a week away, and I could feel it. Something was coming. Lily's nightmares grew worse. She started waking up in the middle of the night, not just screaming but shaking violently, her eyes wide with terror. She kept saying the same thing over and over. "It's getting closer." I didn't know how to protect her. I didn't even know what I was up against. But I wasn't going to let anything happen to my daughter. One afternoon, while Lily was resting, I decided to check on some of the families in town. If this thing was real, and if it marked more than one person, there had to be others like Lily. I started with Jason Miller, a teenager who worked part-time at the general store. His mom answered the door, her face pale and tight. "Jason hasn't been himself lately," she admitted when I asked about him. "He's been having these dreams, says he feels like something's watching him." When I asked if he had any strange marks on his body, her eyes widened. "How did you know about that?" she whispered. She called Jason downstairs, and sure enough, there it was, a faint symbol on his forearm, just like Lily's. My stomach sank as I realized this wasn't just about my daughter. There were others in danger too. Over the next few days I found 3 more teenagers with the same mark. Sarah, a quiet girl who loved painting. Ethan, the high school quarterback, and Mia, a bookworm who spent most of her time at the library. They all described the same thing, nightmares of being hunted by something they couldn't escape. I brought them all together at the ranger station one evening, hoping that if we stuck together we'd be safer. But even then, strange things kept happening. The forest around the station seemed alive. The undergrowth grew thicker overnight, creeping closer to the building like it was trying to swallow us whole. Trees bent unnaturally in the wind, their branches scratching against the windows even though we were far from any large trees. And then there was the resin. It started seeping from cracks in the stone markers we'd found in the woods, thick, amber-colored sap that smelled sharp and metallic. It oozed slowly but steadily, pooling at their bases like blood from an open wound. Lily began acting different. Her senses seemed sharper. She could hear things none of us could, and see details that others missed. At first I thought it might be a good thing, maybe even an advantage, but then she started saying things that made my skin crawl. "It's watching us," she whispered one night as we sat by the fire in the station's main room. "It knows where we are." "How do you know that?" I asked cautiously. She hesitated before answering. "I can feel it." The other kids looked at her nervously, but no one said anything. We all knew she wasn't lying. That night, as everyone tried to sleep in their sleeping bags on the floor of the station, I stayed awake by the window, staring out into the dark forest beyond. The harvest moon was only 3 days away now, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to take Lily and leave this place behind. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever this thing was, it would find us no matter where we went. Around midnight, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, a low guttural growl coming from somewhere deep in the woods. It wasn't an animal. It sounded too big for that, too deliberate. I grabbed my rifle and stepped outside onto the porch, scanning the tree line with my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness but revealed nothing, just shadows shifting between the trees. And then, just for a moment, I saw them. Eyes, glowing amber eyes staring back at me from far off in the woods. I froze as they blinked once, twice, and then disappeared into the darkness. When I went back inside and locked the door behind me, Lily was sitting up in her sleeping bag wide awake. "You saw it," she said quietly. I nodded but didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. The forest didn't feel like the same place anymore. It wasn't just the strange sounds or the growing vines. It was the way it felt, like the woods themselves were alive and watching us. Every time I stepped outside, I could feel it, that heavy, suffocating presence pressing down on me, And I wasn't the only one. The kids were restless. Jason kept pacing back and forth, muttering about how he couldn't sleep. Sarah sat by the window, staring out into the trees like she was waiting for something or someone to show up. Even Lily, who usually tried to stay calm, seemed on edge. She kept rubbing the mark on her wrist like it was burning her. And then it happened. It was late, maybe 2 a.m., and the station was quiet except for the soft crackle of the fire in the corner. I'd finally dozed off in my chair when I heard it, a loud crash, like glass shattering. I shot up, grabbing my flashlight and rifle as the kids woke up in a panic. "Jason!" Sarah screamed. His sleeping bag was empty. I ran toward the sound and found one of the windows completely smashed, shards of glass scattered across the floor. The cold night air rushed in, carrying with it a faint smell of earth and something metallic like blood. "Jason!" I shouted, leaning out of the broken window and shining my flashlight into the darkness. But there was nothing out there, just trees swaying gently in the wind. We searched everywhere, the station, the surrounding area, but Jason was gone. All we found was his backpack lying near the edge of the woods. When I picked it up, something fell out, a fragment of antler, smooth and sharp, glowing faintly in the moonlight. Lily stared at it with wide eyes. "It's here," she whispered. I didn't want to believe her, but deep down I knew she was right. The next morning, we formed a search party with some of the locals. Walter joined us, along with a few hunters who knew these woods almost as well as I did. We combed through every trail, every clearing, calling Jason's name over and over again. Around noon, we found something, a piece of torn fabric caught on a low branch. It matched Jason's jacket, but there was no sign of him anywhere nearby, except for more of that amber-colored resin dripping from a tree trunk close to where we found the fabric. One of the hunters reached out to touch it, but pulled his hand back immediately, wincing in pain. The resin had burned him. "This isn't natural," Walter muttered under his breath. As we continued deeper into the forest, I felt that familiar chill creeping over me again, the feeling of being watched. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches twisting together overhead, like they were trying to block out the sun. And then, we saw it. At first, it was just a shadow moving between the trees, tall and impossibly fast. But as it got closer, we could make out its shape, a towering figure with massive antlers that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. Its eyes glowed amber, piercing through the darkness like twin flames. It didn't move toward us. It just stood there on a distant ridgeline, watching us silently. One of the hunters raised his rifle to aim at it, but I grabbed his arm before he could fire. "Don't," I said firmly. "We don't know what we're dealing with." The figure lingered for a moment longer before disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. When we got back to the station that evening, everyone was shaken. The kids huddled together near the fire, while Walter paced back and forth by the door, muttering under his breath about how none of this made any sense. And then Martha Kingsley showed up. She'd heard about Jason's disappearance and came to check on us. When I told her about what we'd seen in the woods, the glowing eyes, the antlers, her face turned pale. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about people who survived being marked," she said quietly, after a long pause. "But they only survived because someone else took their place."
"So what do you mean?"
I asked sharply. Martha hesitated before answering. "The huntsman doesn't stop until it gets what it came for," she said. "If you want to save them, someone has to take their place willingly." Her words hung in the air, like a heavy weight pressing down on all of us. No one spoke for a long time after that. That night, as I sat by Lily's side while she slept fitfully in her sleeping bag, I couldn't stop thinking about what Martha had said. Was that really our only option? To sacrifice someone else just to save these kids? I didn't know what to do anymore. All I knew was that time was running out, and whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. The station felt smaller every day, like the walls were closing in on us. The kids were scared, and I couldn't blame them. Jason was still missing, and whatever was out there wasn't hiding anymore. Every night we'd hear strange sounds, branches snapping, low growls, and footsteps that seemed to circle the building. It was like the forest itself was alive and trying to push us out. I knew we couldn't stay here much longer. We needed a plan. That morning, I decided to take the kids somewhere safer. A fire lookout tower about a mile away from the station. It was surrounded by cleared ground, high enough to give us a good view of the forest, and sturdy enough to keep whatever was out there from getting in easily. We packed up supplies and made the trek through the woods, sticking close together. Lily walked beside me, her hand gripping my arm tightly. She hadn't said much since Jason disappeared, but I could tell she was holding back tears. When we reached the tower, I felt a small sense of relief. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than being surrounded by trees. We climbed up and settled in, locking the hatch behind us and setting up sleeping bags on the floor. But even as we tried to make ourselves comfortable, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Later that evening, while everyone else rested, Walter showed up at the base of the tower. He'd been out searching for Jason all day and looked exhausted. "I found something," he said grimly. As he climbed up to join us, he pulled out a notebook, old and worn, and handed it to me. It was Reverend Isaiah Thornton's journal, dated back to the 1700s. Walter had found it in one of the abandoned cabins deep in the woods. I flipped through the pages quickly, my heart racing as I read about settlers who had made a pact with the Ancient One to protect their colony during harsh winters. The journal described rituals involving stone markers and sacrifices, volunteers who willingly gave themselves up to keep their families safe. But what really caught my attention was a passage near the end, Waltadra. "The pact is not eternal. The spirit grows restless with each cycle, demanding more than we can give. If the binding object is destroyed, it will be free." "What's the binding object?" I asked Walter. He shrugged. "I don't know for sure," he admitted, "but if this thing is tied to those stone markers, maybe it's connected to something hidden nearby." I didn't have time to dwell on it because that night, things got worse. It started with Sarah waking up screaming. She said she'd seen Jason standing outside in the woods calling her name. At first, I thought she was imagining things, but when I looked out through the tower window, I saw him too. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, his clothes torn and dirty, his face pale as a ghost. He didn't move or say anything, he just stood there staring at us. "Jason," Ethan shouted as he ran toward the hatch. "Wait," I yelled, grabbing his arm before he could open it. "That's not him." Ethan froze and looked at me like I was crazy. "What are you talking about?" "He's right there." But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Jason's eyes, they weren't normal. They glowed faintly amber in the moonlight, the same color as the huntsman's eyes, and then Jason turned and walked back into the woods without a word. The kids were terrified after that, especially Ethan, who kept blaming himself for not running after Jason sooner. But I knew it wouldn't have mattered. Whatever we'd seen, it wasn't Jason anymore. The next morning, Richard Blackwell showed up at the tower unannounced. He was senior park administrator for this region, a man who always seemed calm under pressure. But today he looked anything but calm. "I need to talk to you," he said quietly as he pulled me aside. When we were alone on the tower balcony, he told me something that made my blood run cold. "My family's been managing this land for generations," he admitted. "We've always known about the huntsman." "What are you saying?" I asked sharply. Blackwell sighed heavily before continuing. "Every cycle, someone has to be sacrificed," he said bluntly. "It's how we keep things balanced." I stared at him in disbelief. "You knew this would happen?" He nodded grimly. "I didn't want it to come to this," he said, "but if we don't give it what it wants, more people will die." I clenched my fists as anger boiled inside me. This wasn't just some natural disaster or freak accident. This was planned. Blackwell's family had been covering this up for years, sacrificing innocent people just to keep themselves safe. "I'm not letting you touch these kids," I said firmly. Blackwell didn't argue. He just looked at me with pity in his eyes before walking away. That evening, Lily sat beside me on the balcony as we watched the sun set over the forest below. "Dad," she said softly, "I think I know where it is." Wool is." I asked gently. The thing keeping it here, she replied. I saw it in my dream last night, a cave near those stone markers. Her voice shook as she spoke, but her eyes were steady, determined. I didn't know how she knew this, or if it was even real, but I trusted her instincts more than anything else in this world. Whatever happened next, we were going to face it together. The night after Lily told me about the cave, I couldn't sleep. Her words kept running through my mind, the Sadarati in my dream. How could she know about something like that? And if she was right, what would we find there? I stayed up late, sitting by the window of the tower and staring out into the forest. The moon was almost full now, glowing bright and heavy in the sky, the harvest moon. I could feel it, something was building like a storm waiting to break. Around midnight, I heard footsteps on the stairs outside. I grabbed my rifle and opened the hatch cautiously, only to find Blackwell climbing up. He looked calm, too calm, which immediately put me on edge. I need to talk to you, he said quietly. I didn't trust him, but I let him inside. The kids were asleep on the floor, so we stepped out onto the balcony to talk. You need to understand something, Hull. Blackwell started. This isn't just about you or your daughter. This is bigger than all of us. What are you talking about? I asked sharply. He sighed and leaned against the railing, his face shadowed in the moonlight. My family has been managing this land for generations, he said. We've always known about the huntsman, about what it wants. I felt my stomach twist as he spoke. Every cycle, someone has to be sacrificed, he continued. It's how we keep the balance, how we keep everyone else safe. I stared at him in disbelief. You knew this was going to happen, I demanded. Blackwell nodded slowly. We've always known, he admitted. And now, it's your daughter's turn. I didn't even realize I'd moved until I had him pinned against the railing, my hand gripping his shirt tightly. You stay away from her. I growled. Blackwell didn't fight back. He just looked at me with pity in his eyes. It's not up to me, he said softly. The huntsman has already chosen. I let go of him and stepped back. My chest heaving with anger and fear. There has to be another way, I said firmly. There is, Blackwell replied, straightening his shirt. Someone else can take her place. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. You mean sacrifice someone else? I asked bitterly. Blackwell nodded again. It's not ideal, he admitted, but it's the only way. I didn't say anything after that. I couldn't. The idea of sacrificing someone else just to save Lily made me sick, but so did the thought of losing her. After Blackwell left, Lily came out onto the balcony and sat beside me. She must have heard part of our conversation because she didn't ask what was wrong. She just leaned her head against my shoulder and stayed quiet for a while. Dad, she said softly, after a long pause, I think I know why it marked me. What do you mean? I asked gently. She hesitated before answering. Mom told me once that her grandmother used to live near these woods, she said. She had nightmares too, just like mine. I frowned as her words sank in. Could this thing have been connected to our family all along? I don't want anyone else to get hurt because of me, Lily added quietly. I turned to look at her, my heart breaking at the fear in her eyes. No one's going to get hurt, I promised her. Not you, not anyone else. But deep down, I wasn't sure how I was going to keep that promise. The next morning, Walter came by with more information from Reverend Thornton's journal. He'd found a passage describing a cave near the stone markers, a place where settlers had hidden something important, a stone tablet used in their rituals. If this thing is bound by that tablet, Walter said grimly, destroying it might be our only chance. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all we had. That evening, as we prepared to head into the woods and search for the cave, Blackwell showed up again, this time with 2 armed men from town. We're taking the kids, he announced coldly. Over my dead body, I snapped, stepping between him and Lily. Blackwell raised his hands calmly but didn't back down. If you want to save them all, he said evenly, you'll let us do what needs to be done. Before I could respond, Lily stepped forward and grabbed my arm tightly. Dad, she whispered urgently, we don't have time for this. She was right. The moon was almost full now. and every second counted. I turned back to Blackwell and glared at him fiercely. "Stay out of our way," I warned him before leading Lily and Walter into the woods. As we walked deeper into the forest, following Lily's instincts toward the cave she'd seen in her dreams, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was it, the moment everything would come to a head. Whatever happened next, there was no turning back. The forest was alive with sound as we made our way toward the cave. The wind howled through the trees, and the branches creaked and groaned like they were whispering to each other. Every step felt heavier than the last, like the woods themselves didn't want us there. Lily led the way, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. She didn't say much, but I could see the determination in her eyes. Walter followed close behind, carrying a backpack filled with supplies, rope, tools, and anything else we thought we might need. I brought my rifle, though deep down, I wasn't sure it would do any good against whatever was out there. The moon hung low and full in the sky, casting an eerie glow over everything. It felt like it was watching us, just like the huntsman. After what felt like hours of walking, Lily stopped suddenly and pointed ahead. "It's there," she said softly. I followed her gaze and saw it, a dark opening in the side of a rocky hill, half hidden by overgrown vines and moss. The air around it was colder than it should have been, and that same metallic smell I'd noticed before hung heavy in the air. We approached cautiously, our footsteps crunching on the dead leaves and twigs beneath us. As we got closer, I noticed strange carvings etched into the rocks around the cave entrance, symbols similar to the ones on Lily's wrist and the stone markers we'd found before. "This is it," Walter muttered. "This is where they hid it." We stepped inside, our flashlights sweeping across the damp walls. The cave was narrow at first but quickly opened up into a larger chamber. In the center of the room was what we'd been looking for, a stone tablet resting on a crude altar made of stacked rocks. The tablet was covered in more of those strange symbols, and thick amber resin dripped from its edges onto the ground below. It pulsed faintly in the light, almost like it was alive. "This has to be it," Walter said as he set his backpack down and pulled out a crowbar. But before he could take another step, a sound echoed through the cave, a low, guttural growl that made my blood run cold. "Dad," Lily whispered, grabbing my arm tightly. I turned toward the entrance just as a shadow filled it, a massive figure that ducked to fit through the opening. My breath caught in my throat as it stepped into the light. It was taller than any man I'd ever seen, its body covered in moss and bark-like skin that seemed to shift and twist as it moved. Massive antlers stretched from its head, their tips scraping against the cave ceiling, and its eyes, those glowing amber eyes, burned with an intensity that made me want to look away but couldn't. The huntsman had found us. It didn't attack right away, it just stood there, watching us with those piercing eyes. But its presence filled the room with an overwhelming sense of dread, like all the air had been sucked out. Walter raised his crowbar shakily, but I grabbed his arm before he could do anything stupid. "Don't," I whispered. "It's too strong." The huntsman tilted its head slightly as if studying us. Then it took a slow step forward, its massive feet crunching on the loose rocks beneath them. Lily stepped forward suddenly, her voice trembling but steady. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. The huntsman paused for a moment as if considering her words, but then it let out a deafening roar that shook the walls of the cave and sent shards of rock raining down around us. "Get back," I yelled as I pushed Lily behind me and raised my rifle. I fired a shot straight at its chest, but it barely flinched. The bullet didn't even leave a mark. Walter grabbed a rock from the ground and hurled it at the tablet on the altar. The huntsman let out another roar, this one filled with rage, and lunged toward him with impossible speed. "Run," I shouted as I grabbed Lily's hand and pulled her toward the back of the cave. But there was nowhere to go. The chamber ended in solid rock. We were trapped. The huntsman turned its attention back to us, its glowing eyes locking onto Lily. It reached out with one massive hand, its fingers tipped with sharp claws that glistened in the dim light. "Stop," Lily cried out suddenly. To my shock, it did. The huntsman froze mid-step, its head tilting again as if listening to her. For a moment, everything went silent except for our ragged breathing. "It doesn't want this," Lily said softly, her voice trembling but sure. "It's being forced to do this." I didn't understand what she meant at first, but then I remembered what Gabriel had told me about the settlers binding the spirit to this place with their rituals. This wasn't just a monster, it was something ancient and powerful that had been twisted by human greed and fear. "Lily," I said quietly, "if you can reach it, do it now." She nodded slowly and stepped forward again despite my protests. "You don't have to hurt anyone anymore," she said gently. "We can set you free." The huntsman stared at her for what felt like an eternity before letting out a low growl, not of anger this time, but something else. Something almost like pain. Walter took advantage of its hesitation to swing his crowbar at the tablet again, and this time he struck true. The stone cracked down the middle with a deafening sound like thunder echoing through the cave. The huntsman let out one final roar, a sound so loud and raw that it made my ears ring, and then collapsed to its knees as golden light poured from its body like fireflies scattering into the air. And just like that, it was gone. The cave fell silent after the huntsman disappeared, but the air was still heavy, thick with tension. The cracked tablet on the altar pulsed faintly, its amber resin dripping faster now, pooling on the ground like blood. Walter was gasping for breath, his crowbar still in his hands, and Lily clung to my arm, her eyes wide and filled with fear. "It's not over," she whispered. She was right. The ground beneath us trembled, a low rumble that grew louder with each passing second. The shattered pieces of the tablet began to glow brighter, and the resin seeped across the floor like it was alive, twisting and curling toward us. The walls of the cave seemed to close in, the carvings on them glowing faintly in the darkness. And then, it came back. The huntsman didn't appear as it had before, not solid and towering, but as a swirling mass of shadows and light. Its antlers stretched impossibly wide, its glowing eyes burning brighter than ever. It wasn't bound by its physical form anymore, it was free, and it was furious. "Run," I shouted, grabbing Lily's hand and pulling her toward the entrance. Walter followed close behind, but the resin spread faster than we could move, snaking up the walls and blocking our path. The huntsman roared again, a deafening sound that shook the cave to its core. Rocks rained down from the ceiling as cracks spread across the walls. We were trapped. "Dad," Lily cried out, her voice trembling with fear. I turned to face the huntsman, my rifle useless in my hands. I didn't know what to do, how to fight something that wasn't even solid anymore, but I knew I had to protect her. I raised my rifle anyway, aiming at its glowing eyes. Before I could fire, Lily stepped forward again. "Stop," she shouted, her voice echoing through the cave. "You don't have to do this." The huntsman paused for a moment, its swirling form flickering like a dying flame. Its eyes locked onto Lily, and for a brief second, I thought it might listen to her. But then it lunged forward. I grabbed Lily and pulled her back just as its shadowy claws slashed through the air where she'd been standing. Walter swung his crowbar wildly at the resin-covered walls, trying to break through them, but it was no use. The cave was collapsing around us. And then I remembered something Gabriel had said. "Dimid, if the binding object is destroyed, it will be free." The tablet wasn't just keeping the huntsman bound, it was keeping it alive. If we wanted to stop this thing for good, we had to destroy what was left of it. "Walter," I shouted over the roar of the collapsing cave. "Help me." We ran back toward the altar as Lily stayed behind near the entrance, her flashlight trembling in her hands. The huntsman roared again and lunged toward us, its shadowy form swirling faster now, but Walter swung his crowbar at one of its antlers, knocking it back just enough to give me time. I grabbed one of the larger pieces of the shattered tablet and slammed it against the altar with all my strength. The stone cracked further, glowing brighter now as sparks of amber light shot out from its surface. The huntsman let out another roar, this one filled with pain, and collapsed to its knees again. Its form flickered wildly as if struggling to hold itself together. "Keep going," Walter shouted as he swung his crowbar at another piece of resin-covered rock. I grabbed another shard of the tablet and threw it against the wall as hard as I could. The glow intensified until it was blinding, filling the entire cave with golden light, and then everything stopped. The rumbling ceased, the resin evaporated into thin air, and the huntsman's shadowy form dissolved completely. The glowing amber eyes faded into darkness, leaving only silence behind. We stood there for a moment in stunned disbelief before Walter let out a shaky laugh. "We did it," he said breathlessly. I turned to Lily, who was still standing near the entrance. She looked pale but unharmed, her flashlight dangling limply in her hand. "It's over," I said softly, as I walked toward her and pulled her into a tight hug. "You're safe now." She didn't say anything. She just held on to me tightly as tears streamed down her face. As we climbed out of the cave and into the cool night air, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over me. The forest was quiet again, not in that eerie way it had been before, but peaceful, like it had finally been freed from whatever darkness had been holding it captive. The moon hung high in the sky now, its light soft and calming instead of harsh and foreboding. The nightmare was over, or at least, I hoped it was. The forest felt different now. The air was lighter. The oppressive weight that had hung over everything for weeks was gone. As we walked back through the woods toward the ranger station, I couldn't help but notice how quiet it was, not eerie or unnatural, but peaceful, like the forest was finally able to breathe again. Lily held my hand tightly, her steps slow and careful. She hadn't said much since we left the cave, and I didn't push her to talk. She'd been through too much already. Walter walked ahead of us, his crowbar slung over his shoulder, his face lined with exhaustion but relief. When we reached the station, the kids who had stayed behind rushed out to meet us. Sarah and Ethan hugged Lily tightly, their faces pale but hopeful. Mia stood off to the side, her arms crossed as she blinked back tears. "It's gone," I told them simply. "You're safe now." They didn't ask questions. They just nodded and clung to each other like survivors of a storm. Later that night, as everyone settled in to rest, I sat outside on the porch with Lily. The harvest moon hung low in the sky, its light soft and golden now instead of harsh and foreboding. The woods stretched out before us, quiet and still. "Do you think it's really gone?" Lily asked softly. I hesitated before answering. "I think so," I said finally. "We destroyed what was keeping it here." She nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the trees in the distance. "It wasn't just a monster," she said after a long pause. "It was something else." I knew what she meant. The huntsman hadn't been evil. It had been bound by something it didn't choose, forced to carry out a cycle of violence because of human greed and fear. In the end, it had been as much a victim as anyone else. "I think it's free now," I said gently. Lily looked down at her wrist where the faint mark still lingered, a reminder of everything she'd been through. It wasn't glowing anymore, but it hadn't disappeared completely either. "Why is it still there?" she asked quietly. I didn't have an answer for her. Maybe it would fade with time, or maybe it would stay as a part of her forever, a connection to something ancient and powerful that had changed her life. As we sat there in silence, I thought about everything that had happened, the nightmares, the disappearances, the huntsman itself, and realized how close we'd come to losing everything. But somehow, against all odds, we'd survived. The next morning, Walter packed up his things and headed back into town. He gave me a firm handshake before he left and told me I'd done good, that I'd saved not just Lily but everyone else too. "I couldn't have done it without you," I replied honestly. He smiled faintly and tipped his hat before walking off down the trail. Over the next few weeks, things slowly returned to normal, or as normal as they could be after something like this. The kids went back to their families, though they were quieter now, more thoughtful. They'd seen things no one should ever have to see, but they were alive, and that was what mattered most. Lily and I stayed at the station for a while longer before deciding it was time for a fresh start. We packed up our things and moved to a small town farther south where the woods weren't so dense and life felt simpler. But even then, we didn't forget. 1 year later, during the next autumn harvest moon, Lily and I returned to White Mountain National Forest for one last visit. We brought flowers and placed them at the stone circle near where everything had started. a quiet offering to whatever remained of the huntsman's spirit. The forest around us was thriving now, green and vibrant with new growth that stretched high into the sky. It felt alive in a way it hadn't before, not threatening or oppressive, but full of life and promise. As we stood there in silence, I glanced at Lily's wrist again. The mark was still there, faint but present. And she caught me looking at it. "It doesn't scare me anymore," she said softly. I smiled and wrapped my arm around her shoulders as we turned to leave the circle behind us. The huntsman was gone, but its story would live on forever in these woods. My name is Diana Powell. I'm a park ranger in Olympic National Park, Washington. It's not just a job to me, it's my life. Before this, I was an anthropology professor obsessed with the stories and legends of the Pacific Northwest. But people laughed at me when I started talking about things like cryptids and unexplained phenomena. So I left academia and found a new home in the wilderness. Out here, the forest doesn't judge you, but sometimes it hides secrets you're not ready to find. It all started on a cool autumn morning when I was assigned to survey an unexplored valley deep in the park. The area didn't even have an official name on the map, just a blank space surrounded by dense forest and jagged peaks. My colleagues didn't want to go near it, calling it bad luck territory. I thought they were just superstitious. After all, I'd heard plenty of campfire stories about haunted woods and strange creatures, but nothing had ever come of them. The hike into the valley took most of the day. The air was crisp, and the towering trees cast long shadows over the trail. At first, everything seemed normal, beautiful, even. But as I got closer to the valley, something felt off. The forest was too quiet. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves from squirrels or deer. It was like the whole place was holding its breath. When I finally reached the valley floor, I noticed something strange right away. Ancient stone markers scattered around the area. They were tall and weathered, covered in carvings that didn't look like anything I'd seen before. The symbols were sharp and angular, almost like warnings. I sketched them in my journal and took a few photos for reference. The strangest thing about the valley wasn't just the markers, it was how sound behaved there. My footsteps echoed louder than they should have, as if the air itself was amplifying every noise. When I called out to test it, my voice carried farther than seemed possible, bouncing back at me in distorted fragments. I set up camp near one of the stone markers as the sun dipped below the horizon. The shadows stretched longer and darker than they should have, but I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me after a long day of hiking. As night fell, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching me from the tree line. I wrote everything down in my journal before crawling into my sleeping bag for the night. The last thing I remember before falling asleep was staring at those strange carvings on the stone marker, wondering who had put them there and why. I woke up to a strange sound. It wasn't loud, just faint enough to make me wonder if I'd imagined it. A soft clicking noise, like someone tapping rocks together. My heart started pounding, but I stayed still, listening. The forest was supposed to be silent at night, but this sound didn't belong. When I finally worked up the courage to unzip my tent and peek outside, everything looked normal. The moonlight lit up the clearing, and the trees stood still in the calm night air. But when I stepped out to check my gear, my stomach dropped. My equipment had been moved. Nothing was missing. My backpack was still there, my food untouched, but everything had been rearranged in neat little patterns. My flashlight was standing upright on a rock, and my water bottle was placed next to it like someone had been playing with them. I hadn't done that. I told myself it could have been an animal, a raccoon or a curious bird, but deep down I knew better. Animals don't move things like that. The next morning, I found something even stranger. Just a few feet from my campsite were footprints, or at least half footprints. They looked human, but ended abruptly, as if whoever made them had walked straight into a rock wall and disappeared. I crouched down to examine them closely, tracing the edges with my finger. The prints were deep, too deep for someone just walking casually. I tried using my radio to report what I'd found, but all I got was static mixed with weird clicking noises that sounded almost like the ones I'd heard during the night. Frustrated, I packed up my gear and decided to hike further into the valley to see if there was any logical explanation for what was happening. Before leaving, I stopped by a nearby tribal village to talk to Manuel Redfeather, an elder who knew the area better than anyone else. He listened quietly as I described the stone marker and the strange sounds in the valley. When I mentioned the footprints and moved equipment, his face hardened. "You shouldn't be there," he said firmly. "That place belongs to those who walk in shadows." I asked him what he meant, but he wouldn't say much more, just that they were ancient beings who didn't take kindly to intruders. He handed me a small leather pouch filled with herbs and beads and told me it would keep me safe if I stayed near firelight at night. Then he turned away as if he didn't want to talk about it anymore. I left feeling more uneasy than ever, but determined to figure out what was going on in that valley. After my unsettling conversation with Manuel Redfeather, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this valley than anyone wanted to admit. I spent the next few days digging through old ranger reports and park records, trying to find any mention of strange activity in the area. What I found sent chills down my spine. The first report dated back to 1938. A ranger named Edward Harris had written about hearing unnatural sounds and seeing eyes in the trees. His journal described a growing sense of dread as he explored the valley. He disappeared a week later. They never found his body, just his hat and a torn piece of his uniform near one of the stone markers. There were more incidents too, one in 1952 and another in 1959. Both involved rangers who requested transfers after reporting strange occurrences in the same region. One of them described seeing claw marks on trees too high for any known animal to reach. Another mentioned hearing whispers in a language he didn't understand. I also found something else. All the disappearances and strange events seemed to happen during new moon phases when the nights were at their darkest. I checked my calendar and felt my stomach tighten. The next new moon was only 2 days away. I kept digging and eventually came across an old tribal legend in the park's archives. It spoke of hungry ones who lived deep in the forest, hunting anyone who wandered into their territory. According to the story, these beings were once human but had been cursed after performing forbidden rituals. They were said to move like shadows, blending into the darkness, and their eyes reflected light like mirrors. The more I read, the more everything started to make sense. The strange footprints, the rearranged equipment, the eerie silence in the valley. But it also made me realize how much danger I might be in. That night, as I sat alone in my cabin going over my notes, I started to feel a sharp pain behind my eyes. A migraine so intense it made me dizzy. I closed my journal and stumbled outside for fresh air, but the feeling didn't go away. Instead, it got worse, like something was pressing against my mind. I leaned against a tree trying to steady myself when I thought I heard something faint in the distance. It wasn't clicking this time. It was a low guttural growl that seemed to echo through the forest. My heart raced as I scanned the tree line, but there was nothing there. At least nothing I could see. I went back inside and bolted the door, clutching Manuel's leather pouch like it was a lifeline. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just a story or a legend anymore. It was real, and it knew I was here. I knew I couldn't face this alone. Whatever was in that valley wasn't just some unexplained phenomenon, it was dangerous. I needed backup. So the next morning I went to my supervisor, Ranger Bill Harris, and told him everything. The strange footprints, the rearranged equipment, the tribal warnings, and the eerie history of disappearances. At first he didn't believe me. "Diana, you've been working too hard," he said with a dismissive chuckle. "You're letting those old stories get to your head." But when I showed him the reports and pointed out how all the incidents lined up with the new moon phases, his expression changed. He agreed to authorize a full survey expedition, but warned me not to scare anyone with ghost stories. The team was small, just 3 others besides me. There was Gregory Wilson, a senior ranger who had been in the park for over 20 years and thought he'd seen it all. He didn't hide his skepticism about the whole thing and made it clear he thought I was wasting everyone's time. Then there was Mark Thompson, a rookie ranger who had only been on the job for 6 months. He seemed eager to prove himself and kept asking questions about the valley, though I could tell he was nervous. Finally, We had Dr. Lauren Fisher, a wildlife biologist, brought in to analyze any unusual animal activity we might find. She was sharp and focused, but didn't seem thrilled about being dragged into what she called a wild goose chase. Before we left, I stopped by Manuel Redfeather's house again to see if he would join us. He refused outright. "I've lived long enough to know better," he said firmly. Instead, he handed me more of the protective talismans and told me to keep them close at all times. "You'll need fire," he added as I turned to leave. Said fear it. We set out later that afternoon, hiking deep into the valley with our gear packed tight and our radios tuned to the same frequency. The forest felt heavier this time, like it was watching us move through its shadows. Even Wilson stopped cracking jokes after a while. The silence was too unsettling. By nightfall, we reached the clearing near the stone markers and set up camp. The air felt colder here, sharper somehow, like it carried something invisible but heavy. As we sat around the fire eating dinner, Fisher suddenly spoke up. "Does anyone else feel off?" she asked quietly. We all nodded. That night, we all had nightmares. Different ones, but eerily similar in theme. In mine, I was running through the forest while something chased me from above, leaping from tree to tree with glowing eyes that pierced through the darkness. When I woke up gasping for air, I realized something chilling. Whatever this was, it wasn't just in my head anymore. The next morning, the tension in the camp was thick enough to cut with a knife. No one wanted to talk about the nightmares, but I could see it in their faces. Pale, drawn, and uneasy. Even Wilson, who had been so dismissive before, looked shaken. We decided to split up into pairs to survey the area around the stone markers. Wilson and Fisher headed toward the northern edge of the valley, while Thompson and I took the southern route. The plan was simple: document anything unusual and meet back at camp by noon. As we walked, Thompson kept glancing over his shoulder like he expected something to jump out at us. "Do you really think there's something out here?" he asked quietly. I didn't answer right away. "I don't know," I admitted finally. "But whatever it is, it's not normal." We found claw marks on several trees, long deep gouges that started at least 10 feet off the ground. I ran my fingers over them, feeling the rough edges where bark had been torn away. "No animal I know of can reach this high," I said, more to myself than to Thompson. He didn't respond. When I turned to look at him, he was staring into the forest with wide eyes. "Did you see that?" he whispered. "See what?" "There's something moved between those trees." I squinted into the shadows but saw nothing. "Probably just the wind," I said, trying to sound confident, even though my stomach was twisting into knots. By noon, Wilson and Fisher hadn't returned to camp yet, so Thompson volunteered to go check on them while I stayed behind to organize our findings. He grabbed his radio and flashlight and headed off toward their last known location. An hour passed. Then 2. I tried calling Thompson on the radio, but all I got was static and that strange clicking noise again. My heart started racing as I grabbed my own flashlight and headed in the direction he'd gone. I found his radio first, lying on the ground next to his flashlight, both still working perfectly. They were arranged neatly side by side, just like my gear had been that first night in the valley. But there was no sign of Thompson anywhere, not even footprints leading away from where his equipment had been left. When Wilson and Fisher finally returned to camp later that afternoon, they were shaken but unharmed, though Wilson swore he'd seen eyes watching them from the treetops. "Dozens of them," he muttered under his breath. Thompson was gone. That night, the forest came alive with sounds that didn't belong. It started with the clicking, soft and rhythmic, echoing from all directions. Then came the growls, low and guttural, like something big was circling just beyond the firelight. Wilson paced back and forth near the campfire, his rifle slung over his shoulder. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice sharp and tense. "Whatever's out there, it's not something we can handle." "We can't just leave," I argued, though my hands were trembling. "Thompson is still out there. We have to find him." Wilson shook his head. "He's gone, Powell. You saw how his gear was left. This thing is playing with us." Fisher sat by the fire, staring into the flames with a distant look in her eyes. She hadn't said much since we got back to camp, but now she spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "I keep hearing him," she said. "Thompson. He's calling for help," in my head. Wilson and I exchanged a worried glance. "It's just stress," I said quickly, trying to reassure her, and maybe myself. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The next morning, we found our camp destroyed. The tents were shredded, our food supplies were gone, and our communications equipment was smashed beyond repair. Around the perimeter of the camp, strange symbols had been drawn in ash, symbols that looked eerily similar to the carvings on the stone markers. "This isn't random," I said as I crouched down to examine one of the symbols. "They're trying to hurt us somewhere." Fisher suddenly let out a scream and stumbled backward, clutching her head. "They're here," she cried. "They're watching us." Wilson raised his rifle and scanned the tree line, his finger hovering over the trigger. That's when we saw them, eyes gleaming like mirrors in the shadows between the trees. Dozens of them, just as Wilson had described earlier. They didn't move closer, but stayed just far enough away to make it clear they were in control. "We need to move," Wilson said urgently. "Now." We grabbed what little gear we had left and started hiking toward higher ground, hoping to find some kind of vantage point or shelter. The creatures followed us every step of the way, their reflective eyes flickering in and out of view like fireflies in the darkness. As we climbed higher into the valley, Fisher began to change. She complained about her skin burning in the sunlight and covered her ears whenever we spoke too loudly. Her hearing seemed sharper than normal, almost unnaturally so. "They're inside my head," she whispered at one point, tears streaming down her face. "I can feel them pulling me toward them." I didn't know what was happening to her, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever these creatures were, they weren't just hunting us anymore. We kept moving, climbing higher into the valley, but the creatures didn't stop following us. Their eyes glinted in the shadows, always just out of reach, but close enough to remind us they were there. Fisher was getting worse. She barely spoke now, and when she did, it was in whispers that didn't make sense. "They're waiting," she mumbled at one point, staring blankly ahead. "They want us to see." By late afternoon, we stumbled across something none of us were prepared for. A hidden cave system carved into the side of the valley wall. The entrance was wide and dark, framed by more of those strange stone markers. The carvings on these stones were even more elaborate, almost like a story told in symbols. "This is it," I said quietly. "This is where they come from." Wilson hesitated at the entrance. "Are you sure we want to go in there?" he asked, gripping his rifle tightly. "We don't have a choice," I replied. "If we want to understand what's happening, and if we want to survive, we need answers." The air inside the cave was cold and damp, and the walls were covered in pictographs that sent shivers down my spine. They showed figures, human at first, performing some kind of ritual around a fire. As the story progressed, the figures began to change. Their bodies grew taller and more twisted, their eyes glowing like mirrors. By the end, they weren't human anymore. They were them. "These things used to be people," I whispered, running my fingers over one of the carvings. "Something happened to them, something that turned them into this." Further into the cave, we found evidence of past victims, torn clothing, rusted tools, and scattered equipment that looked decades old. A broken flashlight here, a dented canteen there. It was clear we weren't the first ones to stumble into their territory. Then we found something that made my blood run cold. A journal from 1938. It belonged to Edward Harris, the ranger who had disappeared all those years ago. The last few entries were frantic scrawls about watchers in the trees and eyes that see everything. His final entry simply read, "They're taking me now." Fisher suddenly let out a gasp and collapsed against the cave wall. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and her eyes seemed different, sharper, more reflective. She looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. "I can feel it," she said hoarsely. "They're changing me." Before I could respond, Wilson's voice cut through the silence. "We need to leave, now." But as we turned to head back toward the entrance, a shadow moved across the cave wall, fast and deliberate. They were here. The moment I saw the shadow move, my heart nearly stopped. It wasn't just one of them, it was several, their shapes flickering across the cave walls like living darkness. The clicking sound returned, louder now, echoing off the stone. "Run," Wilson shouted, grabbing Fisher by the arm and pulling her toward the entrance. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my flashlight and sprinted after them, my boots slipping on the damp cave floor. The creatures didn't chase us outright. They didn't need to. They moved with terrifying speed, darting between shadows and cutting off our escape routes. Fisher stumbled as we reached the mouth of the cave, her breathing ragged. "I can't," she gasped, clutching her chest. Her skin looked even worse now, ashen and almost translucent, and her eyes reflected the light from my flashlight like mirrors. "They're inside me," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I can feel them pulling me back." Wilson tried to steady her, but she pushed him away and turned toward the forest. "I have to go," she said softly, her voice eerily calm now. "They're calling me," shouted, grabbing her arm. "You don't have to do this. We can fight it." But she shook her head, a sad smile crossing her face. "It's too late for me." Before we could stop her, she disappeared into the trees, moving faster than seemed humanly possible. Wilson started to go after her, but I grabbed his arm and pulled him back. "She's gone," I said firmly, though my voice was shaking. "We have to focus on getting out of here." The creatures were closing in now, their glowing eyes flickering between the trees like fireflies in the dark. Every step we took felt slower than the last, like the forest itself was trying to hold us back. The clicking sounds grew louder, joined by guttural growls that made my stomach churn. Then I remembered something Manuel had told me, that they fear fire. I fumbled with my pack as we ran, pulling out a flare gun I'd packed for emergencies. With trembling hands, I loaded a flare and fired it into the air. The bright red light cut through the darkness like a blade, illuminating the creatures for just a moment. What I saw made my blood run cold. They were humanoid but twisted, covered in thick black fur with long limbs that moved unnaturally fast. Their faces were hidden in shadow except for their eyes, which gleamed like mirrors reflecting firelight. The flare seemed to work. They retreated slightly, melting back into the shadows of the trees. But I knew it wouldn't last long. "Keep moving," I yelled at Wilson as I loaded another flare. We ran until we reached one of the stone markers near the edge of the valley, the ones Manuel had said formed a boundary. The creatures stopped just short of crossing it, their eyes watching us with an intelligence that sent chills down my spine. For now, we were safe. But Fisher was gone, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Wilson and I barely made it back to the ranger outpost. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and my lungs burned with every breath. But we couldn't stop, not yet. The creatures had retreated at the boundary marked by the stones, but I knew they wouldn't stay away for long. As soon as we reached the outpost, Wilson bolted the door and started barricading the windows with anything he could find: chairs, shelves, even a filing cabinet. I grabbed the emergency kit and lit every lantern and flashlight we had, flooding the small cabin with light. "They're coming," Wilson muttered, pacing back and forth with his rifle in hand. "I know they are." He wasn't wrong. Outside, the forest was alive with movement. The clicking sounds were back, louder now, joined by guttural growls that seemed to vibrate through the walls. I peeked through a crack in the window and saw them, eyes glowing in the darkness, circling the outpost like predators stalking their prey. "We can't hold them off forever," I said, my voice trembling. "We need a plan." Wilson nodded grimly. "What about fire? You said they're afraid of it." I thought about Manuel's warning and the way the creatures had retreated when I fired the flare. "It might work," I said, "but we'll need something bigger than flares to keep them back." That's when I remembered the emergency UV light stored in the outpost for nighttime rescues. It wasn't much. A portable lamp designed to cut through heavy fog, but it might be enough to hurt them. "I have an idea," I said, grabbing the UV lamp from the supply closet. "If they're vulnerable to fire, maybe this will work too." Wilson helped me set up a makeshift trap near the door, using gasoline from the generator to create a fire barrier around the cabin's perimeter. We placed the UV lamp in the center of the room, ready to turn it on as soon as they got close. The first attack came just after midnight. The creatures moved as one, slamming against the walls of the outpost with terrifying force. The entire building shook under their weight, and I could hear their claws scraping against the wood like nails on a chalkboard. "Here they come," Wilson shouted, aiming his rifle at the door. The fire barrier held them back at first, but it didn't stop them completely. They moved like shadows, darting through gaps in the flames and testing our defenses from every angle. One of them managed to break through a window, its long arm reaching inside with claws that glinted in the firelight. Wilson fired his rifle point blank, and the creature let out an ear-piercing screech before retreating into the darkness. But more were coming. "Turn it on," Wilson yelled. I flipped the switch on the UV lamp and a blinding white light filled the room. The effect was immediate. The creatures recoiled violently, their bodies twisting and writhing as if they were in pain. Their growls turned into high-pitched screams that made my ears ring. "It's working," I shouted. We held our ground for what felt like hours, using every flare and flashlight we had to keep them at bay. But then something happened that made my blood run cold. One of them stepped forward, bigger than the others, with eyes that burned brighter than any of them. It didn't retreat from the light, instead it seemed to absorb it, growing stronger as it moved closer. "Diana." Wilson's voice was barely a whisper now. "What do we do?" Before I could answer, there was a loud crash as part of the roof caved in. The creatures swarmed inside, their glowing eyes filling every corner of the room. I grabbed one last flare from my pack and lit it with trembling hands. "Get to the boundary," I screamed at Wilson. He hesitated for only a second before nodding and running toward the door. I followed close behind, holding up the flare like a shield as we fought our way through the swarm. We barely made it past the stone markers before collapsing on the ground, gasping for air. The creatures stopped at the boundary again, their eyes watching us with an intelligence that sent chills down my spine. But this time, one of them stayed behind. It was Fisher. She stood just beyond the marker line, her reflective eyes locked on mine. For a moment, she looked almost human again, like she was trying to say something, but then she turned and disappeared into the forest with the others. The valley was quiet again, but the silence wasn't comforting, it was heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Wilson and I sat just beyond the boundary of the stone markers, too exhausted to speak. My hands were still shaking, and my mind felt like it was spinning in 1,000 directions. Fisher was gone. Thompson was gone. And the creatures, they were still out there, watching us from the shadows. I could feel their presence, even though I couldn't see them anymore. Wilson broke the silence first. "What do we tell them?" he asked, his voice hollow. I didn't answer right away. What could we tell them? That there were humanoid creatures stalking the valley? That Fisher had transformed into one of them? No one would believe us, not without proof, and even then they'd probably dismiss it as some kind of hallucination or stress-induced paranoia. "We tell them it's unsafe," I said finally. "That no one should go back there." When we returned to the ranger station the next day, I filed an official report about what had happened, but as expected, it was met with skepticism. The park administration chalked it up to stress and fatigue, claiming we'd imagined everything after losing Thompson in the woods. They sealed off the valley, citing environmental concerns, and banned any further expeditions into the area. But I knew better. A week later, I was transferred to another park far away from Olympic National Park and its secrets. Wilson stayed behind but told me he planned to retire soon. Neither of us wanted anything more to do with that valley. I tried to move on, but the nightmares never stopped. Every night, I dreamed of glowing eyes watching me from the trees and shadowy figures moving just beyond my reach. Sometimes, I heard Fisher's voice calling out to me, soft and distant, like she was still trapped somewhere between human and whatever she had become. Then one day, a package arrived at my new office, no return address, just my name written in neat black letters on the front. Inside was Fisher's journal. The entries continued long after she disappeared into the forest. My name is Marcus Reynolds, and I work as a park ranger in Everglades National Park, Florida. I've been here for almost 5 years now, transferred after let's call it an incident during my time as a Navy diver. I don't like talking about it much, but let's just say it left me with a fear of deep water that I'm still trying to shake off. The Everglades are beautiful, though, vast wetlands, teeming with life. It's peaceful most days, and I've thrown myself into my work here. It helps me keep my mind off things. My job mostly involves monitoring water quality, checking on wildlife, and making sure tourists don't wander off into dangerous areas. That morning started like any other. The sun was just rising over the swamp, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I was out in one of the more remote sections of the park, testing water samples from a shallow channel. Everything seemed normal at first. Murky water, buzzing insects, the occasional splash of a fish or an alligator slipping beneath the surface. But as I walked further along the bank, something caught my eye. The water in this particular area wasn't murky like it should have been. It was crystal clear, almost unnaturally so. That's not normal for the Everglades. Curious, I knelt down and took a closer look. Then I saw them, 3 dead alligators floating near the edge of the channel. Their bodies were bloated and pale, with no obvious wounds or signs of attack. It was strange enough to make me uneasy. Alligators don't just die like that. Later that day, I heard from some local fishermen who were thrilled about catching record numbers of fish lately. Big ones too, bigger than usual for this area. Tourists were flocking in to try their luck as well, but something about it didn't sit right with me. The ecosystem felt off somehow, like it was out of balance. I mentioned it to Joseph Miller, one of the old-timer guides who'd been working these swamps for decades. He just shook his head and muttered something under his breath about the old one beneath. When I asked him what he meant, he waved me off with a nervous laugh and said it was just an old swamp legend. I should have let it go right there, but I didn't. A few days passed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The Everglades are unpredictable, sure, but this was different. It was like the swamp itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. One morning, I was out on patrol near the same area where I'd found the dead alligators. As I walked along the water's edge, I noticed a strange slime coating some of the plants. It was clear and sticky, almost like jelly, and it shimmered faintly in the sunlight. I'd never seen anything like it before. When I touched it, my fingers tingled, like there was a faint electric charge running through it. The wildlife was acting weird too. Fish were swimming in tight circles near the surface, almost like they were hypnotized. Birds that usually filled the trees with noise were nowhere to be seen. They were avoiding certain areas altogether. Even the air felt different, heavier somehow. Then there was the water itself. The levels were rising, slowly but noticeably, even though we hadn't had any rain recently. It didn't make sense. The swamp is usually predictable when it comes to water levels, but this felt unnatural. That night I had a dream, or maybe it was more like a nightmare. In it, I was underwater, surrounded by darkness so thick I couldn't see my own hands. Something massive was moving in the blackness around me, circling closer and closer. I tried to swim to the surface, but no matter how hard I kicked or how much air I thought I had left, I couldn't reach it. Just as my lungs started to burn and my vision blurred, I woke up gasping for air. I brushed it off as stress, or maybe just my old fears creeping back in. But then it happened again the next night, and the night after that. Each time, the dream felt more real, more vivid. The next day, while taking temperature readings in one of the deeper channels, I noticed something else unusual: cold spots in the water. The Everglades are warm year-round. Even in winter, the water rarely drops below a certain temperature. But here and there, my thermometer showed sharp drops, cold enough to make me shiver when I dipped my hand in. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was happening out here. I couldn't keep this to myself anymore. Whatever was happening in the Everglades wasn't normal, and I needed help figuring it out. That's when I reached out to Dr. Vanessa Rodriguez, a marine biologist I'd worked with on a few projects before. Vanessa was sharp, no nonsense, and knew her stuff when it came to aquatic ecosystems. If anyone could help me make sense of this, it was her. When I told her about the dead alligators, the slime, and the strange wildlife behavior, she agreed to meet me at the park. We started by retracing my steps to the areas where I'd noticed the slime and cold spots. Vanessa took samples of the slime and water while I kept an eye out for anything unusual. It didn't take long for us to find something that stopped us both in our tracks. A sinkhole. It was massive, easily 20 feet across, and it hadn't been there a week ago. The edges were jagged, like it had opened up suddenly, and the water inside was so dark it looked like ink. Vanessa frowned as she checked her GPS. "This isn't on any of the maps," she said. "There's no record of a sinkhole here." We decided to investigate further. Using a small underwater drone Vanessa had brought along, we sent it into the sinkhole to see what we could find. The footage was unsettling. The sinkhole was much deeper than expected, almost like it connected to an underground cavern system. As the drone descended, we spotted fish that didn't belong here, prehistoric-looking creatures with pale skin and oversized eyes. Some of them didn't even look like fish at all. Then the drone's signal cut out. Vanessa cursed under her breath as she tried to get it back online, but there was nothing, just static. We pulled the drone back up, but its camera lens was cracked and its casing was coated in that same strange slime. Later that day, we got word that one of the local tour guides had gone missing. His name was Dale Simmons, a friendly guy who knew these swamps better than anyone else. According to his last radio call, he'd spotted lights under the water near one of his usual routes and went to check it out. Search teams combed the area for hours but found nothing. No boat, no gear, no sign of Dale at all. That night, as I tried to sleep, I felt like I couldn't breathe. It wasn't just another dream this time, it felt real. My chest tightened, my lungs burned, and for a moment I swore I could feel water filling my throat even though I was lying in bed. Something out there wasn't just strange, it was dangerous. After Dale's disappearance, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were dealing with something bigger than just sinkholes or strange wildlife. I spent the next few days digging through old park records, trying to find anything that might explain what was happening. What I found made my skin crawl. There was a pattern, disappearances, strange wildlife behavior, even unexplained flooding, all happening every 27 years. The last incident was in 1978 when 6 people vanished without a trace after reporting strange lights in the water. Before that, in 1951, there were similar reports of dead animals and rising water levels. It went back even further than that, though the details got harder to piece together. I also found accounts from the Seminole tribes who had lived in the Everglades for centuries. They spoke of the hungry water, a force that lived deep beneath the surface and only woke when its territory was disturbed. According to their legends, it wasn't just a creature, it was something ancient, something that didn't belong in our world. Vanessa joined me in the research and made her own discovery. The slime we'd been finding contained compounds she couldn't identify, something completely alien to anything found in freshwater ecosystems. Worse, she noticed it seemed to alter cellular structures in the samples she tested. Whatever this stuff was, it wasn't just strange, it was dangerous. We decided to explore further and found an underwater cave system near one of the deeper sinkholes. Inside, etched into the rock walls, were paintings, centuries old, depicting a massive eel-like creature with no eyes and a humanoid shape. The drawings showed it surrounded by dead animals and people, with arrows pointing toward the surface as if warning others to stay away. It wasn't just folklore anymore, it was real. Vanessa and I knew we couldn't stop now. Whatever was happening in the Everglades wasn't just a coincidence, it was something ancient, something dangerous. We decided to mount an expedition into the deepest sinkhole we'd found, the one that seemed to connect to the underwater caves. It wasn't an easy decision, but we had to understand what we were dealing with. We brought along 2 other park rangers, Tyler Williams and Maria Delgado, for backup. Tyler was young and eager but inexperienced, while Maria was steady and reliable, someone you could trust in a tight spot. We packed specialized equipment, including underwater drones, diving gear, and communication radios. As we approached the sinkhole, everything started going wrong. The air felt heavier than usual, almost suffocating, and our radios picked up strange interference, static mixed with faint voices that sounded like they were underwater. Tyler swore he heard someone whispering his name through the static, but none of us could confirm it. The water around the sinkhole was eerily calm, as if it were waiting for us to make the first move. We sent one of the drones down first to map the area and check for hazards. At first, everything seemed normal. Dark water, rocky walls, but then the drone's camera caught something moving in the shadows. It was massive and fast, disappearing before we could get a clear look. Tyler volunteered to dive in first. Despite my hesitation, "I'll just take a quick look," he said with a nervous grin. "If I see anything weird, I'll come right back." We watched as he descended into the sinkhole, his flashlight cutting through the murky water. For a while, everything seemed fine, until his voice crackled over the radio. "There's something down here," he said, his voice trembling. "It's big and it's glowing." Then there was silence. Vanessa tried calling out to him over the radio, but there was no response. Minutes passed like hours before I made the decision to dive in after him. My fear of deep water clawed at me as I suited up, but I couldn't let Tyler face whatever was down there alone. The moment I entered the sinkhole, I felt it, a coldness that seeped into my bones and made my chest tighten. The deeper I went, the darker it got until my flashlight barely made a dent in the blackness around me. Then I saw it, a massive shadow moving through the water. It wasn't just big, it was unnatural. Something brushed against me, a psychic probe that felt like icy fingers digging into my memories. Images flashed through my mind, my failed Navy mission, my divorce, every fear I'd ever tried to bury. It wasn't just looking at me, it was asterisk inside asterisk me. I found Tyler near one of the cave entrances, unconscious but alive. As I tried to pull him back toward the surface, the cave entrance behind us shifted. It wasn't rock anymore. It was flesh-like and closing fast. We barely escaped. Tyler was shaken but alive when we got him back to the surface. He couldn't talk at first. His breathing was shallow, and his eyes were wide with terror. Eventually, he managed to whisper, "It's watching us. It knows we're here." I didn't need him to explain. I'd felt it too. The presence, the way it reached into my mind and pulled out my worst fears like they were pages in a book. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just an animal or some freak mutation. It was something far worse. Vanessa and Maria were waiting for us on the bank, their faces pale as they helped pull Tyler out of the water. Vanessa kept glancing at the sinkhole like she expected something to crawl out of it at any moment. "We need to leave," Maria said firmly. "This isn't something we can handle." But Vanessa shook her head. "If we leave now, more people are going to die. We have to figure out what this thing is, and how to stop it." I wanted to argue, but she was right. Dale Simmons was still missing, and the rising water levels were starting to flood roads and evacuation routes in the park. Whatever this thing was doing, it wasn't stopping, it was spreading. The next day we went back to the caves with more equipment and a stronger plan. This time, we stayed on the surface while Vanessa sent another drone into the sinkhole. The footage it captured chilled us all. The cavern walls were coated in slime that pulsed faintly, almost like it was alive. Schools of fish swam in perfect unison, forming shapes that looked disturbingly human before scattering again. And then there was the creature itself, a massive, eyeless, eel-like shape that moved with unnatural speed and grace. Its body glowed faintly with bioluminescent patterns that seemed to pulse in time with our own heartbeats. As we watched the footage, Maria suddenly gasped and pointed at the screen. There was a body floating near the edge of the cavern, Dale Simmons. His skin was pale and bloated, his limbs twisted unnaturally as if they'd been melted and reshaped. That's when we realized what the slime really was. It wasn't just residue, it was part of the creature itself, a way for it to consume and mutate anything that got too close. The creature wasn't just expanding its territory, it was turning the swamp into its hunting ground. After seeing Dale's body, the reality of what we were dealing with hit us hard. This wasn't just some strange creature hiding in the depths, it was an apex predator, something that had adapted over centuries to dominate its environment. And now, it was getting stronger. The water levels kept rising, flooding parts of the park that had never been underwater before. Roads were cut off, and tourists were being evacuated in droves. The creature wasn't just staying in the sinkholes anymore, it was moving, expanding its reach. Vanessa started acting off. She was usually calm and focused, but now she seemed distracted, almost obsessed. She kept sketching the same image over and over again, a jagged underwater formation we'd seen in the drone footage. When I asked her about it, she just shook her head and muttered something about finding the source. Meanwhile, Maria and I found more evidence of the creature's influence. Fish were growing larger than they should, their bodies pale and deformed, We even spotted an albino alligator near one of the flooded areas. Its eyes were milky white, and its movements were sluggish, like it was sick. Then we found Tyler. He'd wandered off while we were setting up equipment near one of the deeper channels. When we found him, he was standing waist-deep in the water, staring blankly at nothing. His face was pale, and his lips were moving as if he were talking to someone we couldn't see. "Tyler," I shouted, running toward him. He didn't respond. Before I could reach him, something moved beneath the surface, a school of fish, but not like any I'd ever seen before. They swarmed around Tyler's legs, moving as one, and then he was gone, dragged under so fast I barely had time to react. Maria screamed as I dove into the water after him, but it was too late. All I found was more of that slime clinging to the reeds where he'd been standing. That night, I realized the creature wasn't just hunting, it was controlling everything around it. The fish, the water levels, even people like Tyler. It was all part of its territory now, and we were next. Losing Tyler broke something in all of us. Maria was furious, blaming me for not pulling the plug on this whole thing sooner. Vanessa, on the other hand, had gone quiet. Too quiet. She barely spoke, her eyes distant, like she was listening to something none of us could hear. I knew we couldn't keep going like this. We needed a plan. That's when Vanessa mentioned something she'd found in her research. The creature couldn't survive in salt water. It was a freshwater predator, perfectly adapted to the Everglades but vulnerable to anything outside its environment. If we can flood the sinkholes with salt water, she said, her voice trembling but determined, we might be able to force it back, or kill it. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was the only one we had. The nearest saltwater source was miles away, but there was an old levee system that could be breached to let the water flow into the swamp. It would take time and effort, but it might just work. We split up to prepare. Maria and I worked on setting charges to break the levee while Vanessa stayed behind to monitor the creature's movements. At least, that's what she said she was doing. When we returned to camp later that evening, Vanessa was gone. Her sketches were scattered everywhere, and her notebook was open to a page filled with frantic scrawls. "It's calling me, I have to go. I'll find it." Panic set in as Maria and I realized what had happened. Vanessa had gone back to the sinkhole alone. We raced to the site as fast as we could, but by the time we got there, it was too late. Vanessa was standing on the edge of the water, staring down into the blackness. She turned to look at us as we approached, her face calm but her eyes hollow. "It just wants to survive," she said softly. "It's not evil, it's just hungry." Before we could stop her, she stepped into the water and disappeared beneath the surface. Vanessa was gone, and I felt like the swamp had swallowed her whole. But Maria and I didn't have time to grieve. We had to finish what we started. The levee was our last hope. If we didn't act fast, the creature would spread its influence even further, and more people would die. We reached the levee just as the sun was setting, casting an eerie orange glow over the flooded swamp. The air was thick with humidity, and every sound, the chirp of insects, the splash of distant water, felt amplified, like the swamp itself was alive and watching us. Maria and I worked in silence, setting the charges along the old levee wall. My hands were shaking as I wired the detonator, but I forced myself to focus. This had to work. Just as we were finishing, the water around us began to ripple. At first it was subtle, small waves lapping against the shore, but then it grew stronger, more violent. Something massive was moving beneath the surface. "It's here," Maria whispered, her voice trembling. The water exploded as the creature emerged, its massive, eyeless body glowing faintly in the dim light. It was even bigger than I'd imagined. Its eel-like form stretched longer than a school bus, and its bioluminescent patterns pulsed like a heartbeat. It didn't have eyes, but I could feel it looking at us, probing our minds like it had before. Maria screamed as the creature lunged toward us, its body moving with impossible speed. I grabbed her arm and pulled her back just in time, but we both knew we couldn't outrun it. "Set it off," Maria shouted. "Do it now." I hesitated for a split second, just long enough to see Vanessa's face flash in my mind, but then I hit the detonator. The explosion rocked the swamp, sending a wall of salt water rushing toward us. The creature let out a sound I'll never forget, a deep, guttural roar that seemed to shake the very ground beneath us. The salt water hit it like acid, burning its flesh and forcing it to retreat back into the sinkhole. For a moment, I thought we'd won, but then the ground beneath us began to collapse. "Run!" I yelled as Maria and I scrambled to higher ground. Behind us, the sinkhole caved in on itself, swallowing everything around it, including the creature. We barely made it out alive. The swamp was quiet after the explosion, too quiet. The water levels began to recede, and the wildlife slowly returned to normal. But the air still felt heavy, like it was holding on to the memory of what had happened. Maria and I sat on the bank, exhausted and shaken, watching the sinkhole fill with debris and salt water. The Park Service showed up a few hours later, but when we tried to explain what we'd seen, they didn't believe us. They chalked everything up to unusual weather patterns and sinkhole activity. Dale Simmons was officially listed as missing, and Vanessa's disappearance was ruled an accident. As for Tyler, well, they didn't even bother looking for him. Maria quit her job a week later. She said she couldn't stay in the Everglades anymore, not after everything that had happened. I couldn't blame her. As for me, they reassigned me to another park in a different state. I tried to move on, but I couldn't stop thinking about the creature, about how it had retreated instead of dying. It wasn't gone. It was just hiding, waiting for the right moment to return. Even now, years later, I still keep an eye on water quality reports and wildlife patterns, looking for signs of its influence. Sometimes I think I feel it, like a faint psychic touch brushing against my mind when I'm near certain lakes or rivers. The last time it happened, I was fishing in a quiet state park far from Florida. The water was calm, the sun was setting, and then I felt it again, that cold, probing presence. It's still out there, waiting. My name is Vincent Morales. I've been a park ranger at Mammoth Cave National Park for over 20 years. I know these caves better than I know myself. Every crack, every passage, every sound, it's all etched into my mind like a map. But lately, something hasn't felt right. The caves, they've been whispering to me. It started during a routine safety inspection last Tuesday. I was walking through the tourist section of the cave, checking the railings and lights, making sure everything was in order. The air felt heavier than usual, like it was pressing down on my chest. I chalked it up to my arthritis acting up again. It's been getting worse lately, but then I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. It was faint, almost drowned out by the dripping of water from the limestone ceiling. At first, I thought it might be one of the other rangers working nearby, but when I called out, no one answered. The sound wasn't random either. It had a rhythm to it, like someone was tapping out a message. I followed the noise deeper into the cave, past the usual tourist spots. That's when I noticed something strange. A narrow passage that hadn't been there before. It looked like part of the wall had collapsed recently, revealing a tunnel just wide enough for someone to squeeze through. I didn't remember seeing this during my last inspection, and trust me, I don't forget things like that. Curiosity got the better of me, so I crouched down and peered inside. The tunnel stretched into darkness, and even with my flashlight, I couldn't see where it ended. The tapping had stopped by now, replaced by an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. Later that day, a tourist came up to me near the visitor center. She looked pale and shaken, and asked if there were any kids playing in the caves. When I told her no, she swore she'd heard children laughing in one of the empty sections of the cave. That sent a chill down my spine. I brushed it off as an overactive imagination. Caves can play tricks on your senses, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That narrow passage I'd found, the tapping sounds, the tourist hearing children, it all felt connected somehow. I decided to take another look, but this time I wasn't going alone. "Allison, you busy?" I asked Ranger Allison Turner, one of the newer rangers on our team. She was sharp, eager to learn, and not afraid to get her hands dirty. "Not really. What's up?" she replied, adjusting her hat. "I found something yesterday during my inspection. A new passage. Thought we could check it out together." Her face lit up with curiosity. A new passage. How come no one's mentioned it before? "That's what I'm trying to figure out," I said. We grabbed our gear, flashlights, radios, helmets, and headed back into the cave. As we walked through the familiar tunnels, I couldn't help but feel a strange tension in the air. It wasn't just the usual damp chill of the cave, it was something else, like the walls themselves were watching us. When we reached the narrow passage, Allison crouched down and shined her flashlight inside. "Looks tight," she said. "You sure this wasn't here before?" "I'm positive," I replied. "I know this section like the back of my hand." She nodded and slipped inside first, crawling on her hands and knees. I followed close behind, my joints protesting with every movement. The tunnel was rough and uneven, the kind of place that hadn't been touched by human hands in centuries, if ever. After about 10 minutes of crawling, we emerged into a small chamber. The air here was colder, and our flashlights revealed strange claw-like marks etched into the limestone walls. They weren't deep, but they were deliberate, like someone or something had been here before us. "What do you think made these?" Allison asked. "Could be animals," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. "Maybe bats or raccoons." She frowned but didn't press further. As we moved deeper into the chamber, our radios started acting up. Static crackled through the speakers, followed by faint echoes of our own voices, but distorted, like they were being played back from somewhere else. "Did you hear that?" Allison whispered. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "Stay close," I said. We kept moving, and soon stumbled upon something that stopped us both in our tracks, a rusted old lantern lying on the ground. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, yet when I picked it up and sniffed it, there was a faint smell of oil. "Fresh oil, that doesn't make any sense," Allison said quietly. Before I could respond, a low hum filled the air around us. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. It felt wrong somehow, like it didn't belong here. "We should head back," I said finally. Allison didn't argue. We retraced our steps through the tunnel and back into the main cave system. But as we walked back toward the visitor center, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone anymore. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those claw marks on the walls and heard that strange hum echoing in my head. Something about it all felt ancient, like we had stumbled into a part of the cave that wasn't meant to be disturbed. I decided to dig into the history of Mammoth Cave, hoping to find some kind of explanation. The park's archives were full of old maps, journals, and reports from past expeditions. I'd spent years studying them during my downtime, but now I was looking for something specific, something that could explain what Allison and I had found. It didn't take long to notice a pattern. There were dozens of missing persons cases connected to the cave system, some dating back over 100 years. Most of them were dismissed as accidents, people getting lost or falling into hidden crevices. But the more I read, the stranger it got. One report from 1935 caught my attention. It was written by a man named Henry Caldwell, the leader of an expedition that had gone deeper into the caves than anyone before them. His journal described hearing unnatural sounds and seeing pale figures watching them from the shadows. The last entry was chilling. "They are not human anymore. We should not have come here." The expedition never returned. I also found an old photograph from the 1970s taken by a group of spelunkers. At first glance, it looked like a normal shot of a cave chamber, but in the background, barely visible against the limestone wall, was a pale humanoid figure. It had no eyes. I showed the photo to Jackson Miller, a local historian who'd spent his life studying the folklore of Mammoth Cave. When he saw it, his face went pale. "You ever hear about those who went into the earth?" he asked. "No," I said. "What is it?" "It's an old legend," Jackson explained. "The story goes that centuries ago, some people got lost in these caves and never came back. Over time, they changed, became something else. The locals used to say you could hear them if you listened closely enough." "Hear them?" I asked. He nodded. "Tapping sounds, whispers, sometimes even voices calling your name." A chill ran down my spine as I thought about the tapping I'd heard in the cave and the tourist who swore she'd heard children laughing. "Do you believe it?" I asked. Jackson shrugged. "I don't know what to believe anymore. When I left his office, it felt like the walls of the world were closing in on me. Whatever was in that cave wasn't just some animal or geological oddity, it was something older, something dangerous. And I had a feeling it wasn't done with me yet. After everything I'd read and heard, I knew I couldn't ignore this anymore. Whatever was in that cave wasn't just a story or a coincidence. It was real, and it was dangerous. I needed help to figure out what we were dealing with, and fast. The next morning, I went straight to the park office and started making calls. By noon, I had a small team assembled. There was Allison, of course. She'd already seen some of the strange things in the cave and wasn't about to back out now. Then there was Dr. Howard Reed, a geologist who'd worked with the park on several projects before. He was an expert in cave formations and had access to some advanced equipment for mapping underground spaces. Finally, I brought in Rebecca Wells, a professional cave diver with years of experience navigating tight, dangerous passages. This isn't going to be a regular exploration, I told them as we gathered around the map of the cave system in my office. We found something unusual. Strange sounds, claw marks on the walls, even signs that someone or something might be living down there. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. Living down there? Like what? Animals? I don't think so, I said quietly. Dr. Reed leaned forward, studying the map. You're saying there's an undiscovered passage connected to the main system? I nodded. It looks that way. Allison chimed in. We also found an old lantern down there, one that smelled like it had been used recently. Rebecca whistled softly. Okay, now you've got my attention. We spent the rest of the day preparing for the expedition. Dr. Reed brought along some high-tech gear, including sonic mapping tools that could create 3D images of the cave's layout using sound waves. Rebecca packed her diving equipment, just in case we ran into any flooded passages. Allison and I made sure we had plenty of flashlights, backup batteries, ropes, and first aid supplies. By late afternoon, we were ready to head into the cave. As we descended into the familiar tunnels, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The air felt colder than usual, and our footsteps echoed strangely off the walls. Even Dr. Reed, who was usually calm and analytical, seemed uneasy. When we reached the narrow passage Allison and I had discovered earlier, Rebecca stopped and shined her flashlight inside. Looks tight, she said with a grin. Good thing I'm not claustrophobic. One by one, we crawled through the tunnel until we reached the chamber on the other side. This time it felt different. Darker somehow, like the shadows were thicker than they should have been. Dr. Reed set up his sonic mapping equipment while Rebecca scouted ahead with Allison. I stayed behind to keep an eye on things and make sure our radios were working. That's when it started. First, it was just little things, our flashlights flickering for no reason. Faint static coming through our radios even though we were only a few feet apart. Then we started hearing voices, not loud or clear enough to understand, but just enough to make your skin crawl. Did you hear that? Rebecca asked as she came back into the chamber. I nodded grimly. Voices? She nodded back. Dr. Reed looked up from his equipment with a puzzled expression. This doesn't make sense, he said. The sound waves are bouncing back in ways they shouldn't be. What do you mean? Allison asked. It's like something's interfering with them, he said slowly. Before he could explain further, my radio crackled to life with a sound that made my blood run cold. It was my brother's voice. Vincent, it whispered softly. I froze in place, my heart pounding in my chest. My brother had died in a cave collapse when we were teenagers. There was no way his voice could be coming through that radio. Vincent, it repeated, louder this time. Allison grabbed my arm. Are you okay? I shook my head and turned off the radio. We need to keep moving, I said firmly. But deep down I knew this wasn't going to end well. We pressed on, the air growing colder with every step. The walls of the cave seemed to close in around us, and the darkness felt thicker, heavier. Even with our flashlights, it was hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Every sound, our footsteps, the dripping of water, the faint hum of the sonic mapping equipment, echoed unnaturally, like the cave was amplifying it in ways that didn't make sense. Rebecca was leading the way when she suddenly stopped and held up her hand. Wait, she whispered. We all froze. What is it? I asked quietly. She pointed her flashlight toward a shadowy corner of the chamber. I thought I saw something move. Dr. Reed scoffed nervously. Probably just a bat. But Rebecca shook her head. No, it wasn't a bat. It was bigger. We stood there in silence, straining our ears for any sound. That's when we heard it, a faint clicking noise, like someone tapping two stones together. It was coming from deeper in the cave. Allison stepped closer to me. What is that? She whispered. I don't know, I admitted, my voice barely audible. The clicking grew louder, more rhythmic, as if whatever was making it was getting closer. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, something pale darting across the edge of our flashlight beams. Did you see that? Rebecca hissed. I saw it, I said, my voice tight. Dr. Reed fumbled with his equipment, trying to record the sounds. This is incredible, he muttered, though his hands were shaking. We moved cautiously toward the source of the clicking, our flashlights sweeping across the walls and ceiling. That's when we found it, a strange residue smeared along the limestone. It was translucent and fibrous, almost like spider silk, but thicker and wet to the touch. What is this? Allison asked, her voice trembling. I don't know, I said again, though my gut told me we were getting too close to something we shouldn't be disturbing. Rebecca crouched down to examine the residue when she suddenly froze. Guys, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Look up. We all tilted our flashlights upward, and that's when we saw it. Clinging to the ceiling above us was a pale humanoid figure. Its skin was almost translucent, stretched tight over its thin frame. It had no eyes, just smooth patches of skin where its sockets should have been, but its head twitched toward us as if it could sense us anyway. Its limbs were long and spindly, with fingers that ended in sharp claws digging into the rock. For a moment, none of us moved or even breathed. Then it let out a low clicking sound that echoed through the chamber like a ripple in water. Back away, I whispered urgently. Slowly, we started to retreat, but before we could get far, the creature scuttled across the ceiling with terrifying speed, disappearing into the shadows ahead of us. The sound of its claws scraping against the rock made my skin crawl. What was that? Dr. Reed stammered. I don't know, I said for what felt like the 100th time that day, but we need to get out of here. Before we could turn back, another sound stopped us in our tracks, a voice calling out from deeper in the cave. Help me, it cried weakly. It sounded like Turner's voice. Allison grabbed my arm. That's not possible, she said shakily. Turner's right here. I looked around and realized she was right. Turner was standing next to me, her face pale as a ghost. Then who? Rebecca started to say, but trailed off as another voice joined in. This time it sounded like Dr. Reed's voice calling for help from another direction entirely. The voices multiplied, overlapping and echoing through the chamber until they were coming from every direction at once. They weren't just calling for help anymore. They were mocking us, repeating fragments of things we'd said earlier in distorted tones that made my stomach churn. We need to leave, I said firmly. But as we turned back toward the narrow passage we'd come through, we realized something horrifying. The entrance had collapsed behind us. We were trapped. Panic set in the moment we saw the collapsed passage. The way out was gone, buried under tons of rock. For a few seconds, no one said a word. The only sounds were our heavy breathing and the faint echoes of those eerie, mocking voices fading into the distance. We're trapped, Rebecca finally said, her voice shaking. Stay calm, I said, trying to keep my own fear in check. There's always another way out. We just have to find it. Dr. Reed was pacing back and forth, muttering to himself. This can't be happening. This isn't real. It's just the cave playing tricks on us. Allison grabbed his arm to steady him. Dr. Reed, focus. We need you. He nodded reluctantly, though his hands were still trembling. We decided to move deeper into the cave, hoping to find another exit or at least a larger chamber where we could regroup. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every so often I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, something pale and quick darting between the shadows, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. The clicking noises started again, faint at first but growing louder as we moved forward. It wasn't just one source anymore. It was coming from all around us, echoing off the walls like some kind of twisted symphony. "Keep moving," I said quietly. We entered a new chamber, and that's when we found it, paintings on the walls drawn in what looked like charcoal and red pigment. The images showed humanoid figures descending deeper and deeper into the earth. At first, they looked normal, people with torches and tools, but as the drawings progressed, the figures became more distorted. Their limbs grew longer, their eyes disappeared, and their mouths opened wide in silent screams. "What is this?" Allison whispered, running her fingers over one of the drawings. "It's a story," Rebecca said softly. "A story about people who went too far." I didn't respond because something else had caught my attention. A helmet lying on the ground near one of the walls. It was Allison's helmet. She froze when she saw it. That's mine," she stammered. "No," I said firmly. "Yours is on your head." She reached up and touched her helmet as if to confirm it was still there. Then she took a step back, her eyes wide with fear. "How did it get here?" she asked. Before I could answer, we heard her voice again, calling out from somewhere deeper in the cave. "Help me," it cried. Allison clutched my arm tightly. "That's not me," she whispered. "Oh, I know," I said grimly. The voices started again, overlapping and growing louder until they were all around us. They weren't just mimicking us anymore. They were laughing at us, mocking us with distorted versions of our own words. Dr. Reed couldn't take it anymore. He bolted toward one of the tunnels leading out of the chamber, ignoring our shouts to stop. "Reed!" Rebecca yelled after him. But he didn't listen. He disappeared into the darkness, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly as he ran. "We have to go after him," Rebecca said urgently. "No," I said firmly. "If we split up now, we'll never make it out." Rebecca hesitated but eventually nodded. We decided to stick together and keep moving forward, not because we wanted to, but because there was no other choice. As we ventured deeper into the cave system, the air grew colder and heavier, making it harder to breathe. The clicking noises followed us wherever we went, sometimes close enough that I thought I could feel them vibrating through my chest. Then we found another chamber, and this one was worse than anything we'd seen so far. The floor was littered with bones, animal bones and human bones mixed together in a chaotic pile. Some of them looked ancient, worn smooth by time, while others looked disturbingly fresh. In the center of the chamber was a large stone slab covered in more of that translucent residue we'd seen earlier. It looked like some kind of nesting area or feeding ground. Rebecca turned away and gagged while Allison clung to my arm for support. I forced myself to stay calm even though every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. "We need to keep moving," I said quietly, but before we could leave, something moved in the shadows ahead of us, a pale figure stepping into view with slow, deliberate movements. It stood upright this time, its head tilted slightly as if studying us. Then it opened its mouth and let out a sound that wasn't quite a scream but wasn't human either. It echoed through the chamber like a physical force, making my ears ring and my vision blur. "Run!" I shouted. We turned and bolted down one of the tunnels without looking back. The clicking noises grew louder behind us as more creatures joined in the chase. Their movements were fast and erratic, scuttling along the walls and ceiling like insects, but always staying just out of reach of our flashlight beams. I didn't know where we were going or if there was even a way out anymore. All I knew was that we couldn't stop running. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs felt like they were going to give out. The tunnels twisted and turned, and I had no idea where we were anymore. The creatures were still behind us, their clicking sounds echoing closer and closer. Every time I glanced back, I thought I saw pale shapes darting in and out of the shadows, but I couldn't be sure. My mind was racing, my instincts screaming at me to keep moving. Finally, we stumbled into another chamber, a massive one this time. The ceiling stretched high above us, disappearing into the darkness, and the walls were lined with jagged limestone formations that looked almost like teeth. In the center of the room was something that made my stomach drop. It was a pile of human remains. Bones were scattered everywhere. Skulls, ribs, femurs, all piled haphazardly on top of each other. Some were old and yellowed, while others looked disturbingly fresh. Bits of clothing clung to some of the skeletons, tattered and stained with what could only be dried blood. Among the bones were primitive tools, stone knives, carved sticks, things that looked like they belonged to another time entirely. Rebecca gasped and covered her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. Allison clung to my arm, her eyes wide with terror. "What is this place?" she asked shakily. I didn't have an answer. My mind was too busy trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't just a feeding ground or a nest. It was something worse. It was a graveyard. As we moved closer, I noticed something else, paintings on the walls similar to the ones we'd seen earlier, but more detailed. They told a story, one that made my blood run cold. The first images showed humans entering the cave system, explorers with torches and tools. As the story progressed, the figures began to change. Their eyes disappeared, their skin grew pale, and their limbs stretched unnaturally long. The final images showed them hunting others who entered the caves, dragging their prey into the darkness. "They were human," Rebecca said softly, staring at the paintings. "These things, they used to be people." I didn't want to believe it, but it made too much sense. The claw marks on the walls, the strange residue, the voices mimicking us, it all pointed to one horrifying conclusion. These creatures weren't just animals or monsters. They were what was left of those who had gotten lost in the caves centuries ago. "They've adapted," I said quietly, more to myself than anyone else. "They've evolved to survive down here." Allison shook her head in disbelief. "But how? How could this happen?" "Isolation," Rebecca said grimly. "No light, no food except what they could find. Over generations they must have changed." Before we could say anything else, we heard a sound that froze us in place, a low growl coming from one of the tunnels behind us. It wasn't like the clicking noises we'd heard before. This was deeper, more guttural. It sounded angry. "They know we're here," I said. Rebecca grabbed my arm and pointed toward another tunnel on the far side of the chamber. "We need to go, now." We started moving again, but as we passed by the pile of bones, something caught my eye, a faint movement among the remains. At first I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but then I saw it clearly. Turner and Dr. Reed were there. They were lying near the edge of the pile, their bodies limp but still breathing. Their eyes were open but glazed over like they were in some kind of trance. "Turner!" Allison cried out and ran toward her. "Wait!" I shouted after her, but it was too late. As soon as Allison touched Turner's arm, Turner's head jerked toward her with unnatural speed. Her mouth opened wide, not in a scream but in a distorted clicking sound that echoed through the chamber like nails on a chalkboard. Allison stumbled back in shock as Turner's body convulsed violently before going still again. "They've done something to them," Rebecca said urgently. "We can't stay here." I wanted to argue. I didn't want to leave anyone behind, but deep down I knew she was right. Whatever had happened to Turner and Dr. Reed wasn't something we could fix right now. "We'll come back for them," I said firmly, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. Rebecca nodded reluctantly, and we started moving toward the far tunnel again. But before we could reach it, one of the creatures stepped into view from the shadows ahead of us. It wasn't alone. Dozens of them emerged from every direction, climbing down from the walls and ceiling like spiders, their pale bodies blending almost perfectly with the limestone formations around them. Their eyeless faces twitched toward us as they clicked and hissed in unison. We were surrounded. The creatures closed in around us, their clicking sounds growing louder and more erratic. My flashlight beam shook as I tried to keep it steady, sweeping across their pale, eyeless faces and twisted limbs. They moved with unnatural precision, climbing the walls and ceiling like insects, their claws scraping against the rock. "Stay together," I shouted, my voice echoing through the chamber. Rebecca grabbed my arm, her face pale but determined. "Vincent, what do we do?" I didn't have an answer. My mind was racing, searching for a way out, but every tunnel seemed blocked by the creatures. They weren't attacking yet, just watching us, surrounding us like predators waiting for the right moment to strike. Allison was trembling beside me. "They're everywhere," she whispered. I tightened my grip on her shoulder. "Don't lose focus. We'll find a way out." One of the creatures stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. It tilted its head toward us, clicking softly as if communicating with the other. Then it opened its mouth and let out a sound that made my ears ring and my vision blur. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp and piercing, like it was designed to disorient us. Rebecca stumbled back, clutching her ears. "What is that?" "They're using sound," I said through gritted teeth. "It's how they hunt." The creatures started moving faster now, closing the distance between us, inch by inch. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. We couldn't stay here. We had to move. "Follow me," I shouted, and bolted toward the narrowest tunnel I could find. It wasn't ideal. It barely looked big enough for us to squeeze through, but it was our only option. Rebecca and Allison followed close behind as we crawled into the tunnel, our flashlights barely illuminating the space ahead of us. The clicking noises echoed through the passage, growing louder with every second. "They're coming," Allison cried out. I glanced back and saw one of the creatures squeezing into the tunnel behind us, its long limbs folding unnaturally as it crawled toward us with terrifying speed. "Keep moving," I shouted. We scrambled through the narrow passage until we reached another chamber, a smaller one this time, but with no visible exits. My stomach dropped as I realized we were trapped again. Rebecca turned to me, her breathing ragged. "Vincent." "What now?" I scanned the room desperately, searching for anything we could use to defend ourselves. That's when I remembered the Park Service whistle hanging around my neck, the one we used for emergencies during search and rescue operations. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Cover your ears," I said quickly. "What?" Allison asked, confused. "Just do it," I shouted. They obeyed as I raised the whistle to my lips and blew as hard as I could. The sound was sharp and piercing, amplified by the acoustics of the cave. The creatures froze in place, their heads twitching violently as they let out distorted screeches of pain. "It's working," Rebecca shouted. I kept blowing the whistle, moving toward the center of the chamber to maximize its effect. The creatures started retreating, scuttling back into the tunnels like spiders fleeing from light. But as they disappeared into the shadows, they began clawing at the walls and ceiling, dislodging chunks of rock that rained down around us. "They're trying to trap us," Allison screamed. A massive boulder crashed down near the entrance of the chamber, sealing off one of the tunnels completely. Dust filled the air, making it hard to see or breathe. "We need to move. Now," Rebecca shouted. I grabbed Allison's hand and pulled her toward a small opening near the floor, a water-filled passage that looked like it might lead somewhere else. Rebecca followed close behind as we crawled into the passage, our bodies half submerged in icy water. The tunnel twisted and turned endlessly, narrowing so much at times that I thought we'd get stuck. The water rose higher with every step until we were practically swimming through it. My arms ached from pulling myself forward, but I refused to stop. Finally, after what felt like hours, we emerged into another chamber, a larger one this time with a faint glimmer of light coming from above. It wasn't much, just a crack in the ceiling, but it was enough to give me hope. "There," I said breathlessly, pointing toward the light. Rebecca nodded and started climbing toward it while Allison helped me push myself up despite my aching joints. The climb was slow and painful, every movement sending sharp stabs of pain through my knees, but eventually we reached the crack and squeezed through it one by one. When we finally emerged into daylight, I collapsed onto the ground outside the cave entrance, gasping for air. Allison and Rebecca were beside me, equally exhausted but alive. We'd made it out, but at what cost? We didn't have much time to rest. The sunlight felt like a blessing against my skin, but the moment was short-lived. Behind us, deep in the cave's entrance, the clicking sound started again, faint at first, but growing louder with every passing second. "They're coming," Rebecca said. her voice barely above a whisper. I pushed myself to my feet, ignoring the pain in my knees and back. We can't stop here. We have to keep moving. Allison looked pale and shaken, but she nodded. Where do we go? They're not going to stop. I scanned the area around us. We were in a remote part of the park, far from any trails or visitor areas. The dense forest stretched out in every direction, and the cave entrance loomed behind us like a gaping wound in the earth. Then I noticed something, a narrow ravine cutting through the rocks nearby. It wasn't much, but it might give us a chance to put some distance between us and the creatures. This way, I said, motioning for them to follow me. We stumbled into the ravine, our footsteps crunching against loose gravel and broken branches. The walls of the ravine rose high on either side, casting long shadows that made it hard to see what lay ahead. The clicking noises followed us, echoing off the rocks like they were right behind us. They're faster than we are, Rebecca said, glancing over her shoulder. We can't outrun them. She was right. My legs felt like lead, and every step sent sharp jolts of pain through my joints. The creatures were relentless. They didn't tire, didn't hesitate. They were hunters, and we were their prey. I stopped abruptly and turned to face the others. We're not going to make it if we keep running, I said. We have to fight back. Allison's eyes widened in fear. Fight back? With what? We don't have weapons. I reached for the whistle around my neck, the same one that had driven them back in the cave. It wasn't much, but it was all we had. They're sensitive to sound, I said. If we can find a way to amplify this. My voice trailed off as an idea began to form in my mind. Rebecca caught on quickly. The ravine, she said. The walls will bounce the sound back and forth. It'll be louder. Exactly, I said. Allison looked doubtful, but didn't argue. What if it doesn't work? Then we don't have a chance anyway, I said grimly. The clicking grew louder as the creatures emerged from the cave entrance, their pale forms moving with terrifying speed across the rocky terrain. There were more of them now, dozens at least, and they moved as one like a swarm of insects converging on their target. Get ready, I said, raising the whistle to my lips. Rebecca and Allison covered their ears as I blew into the whistle with all the strength I could muster. The sound was sharp and piercing, amplified by the natural acoustics of the ravine. It echoed off the walls, creating a deafening cacophony that made my own ears ring despite my efforts to block it out. The creatures froze in their tracks, their heads jerking violently as they let out distorted screeches of pain. Some of them clawed at their heads while others retreated back toward the cave entrance. It's working, Rebecca shouted over the noise, but it wasn't enough. The creatures regrouped quickly, their hive mind adapting to the attack. They began climbing up the walls of the ravine, trying to flank us from above. We need more, Allison yelled. I looked around desperately for something, anything that could amplify the sound further. That's when I noticed a large boulder perched precariously near the edge of one of the ravine walls. If we could dislodge it. Rebecca, I shouted, help me with that boulder. She nodded and ran toward it while Allison continued blowing her own emergency whistle to keep the creatures at bay. Together, Rebecca and I pushed against the boulder with all our strength until it finally gave way, tumbling down into the ravine with a thunderous crash. The impact created a shockwave that sent dust and debris flying everywhere and amplified the sound even further as it echoed through the narrow passage. The creatures couldn't handle it anymore. They let out one final screech before retreating en masse back toward the cave entrance, disappearing into its shadowy depths like phantoms vanishing into thin air. For a moment, there was silence, blessed silence, broken only by our ragged breathing. Did we get them? Allison asked hesitantly. I don't know, I admitted. But we bought ourselves some time. Rebecca nodded grimly. Let's not waste it. We climbed out of the ravine and started making our way back toward civilization, our bodies battered but our spirits unbroken. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the forest floor, but for once, those shadows didn't seem so threatening. As we walked, I couldn't shake one lingering thought: this wasn't over. Not yet. We finally made it back to the park's main trail as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. None of us spoke as we trudged forward, our bodies exhausted and our minds still reeling from what we'd just been through. When we reached the visitor center, I radioed for help. Within an hour, park medics and local authorities arrived, their faces a mix of confusion and concern as they listened to our story. I could tell they didn't believe us. Not really. How could they? It sounded insane even to me. Turner and Dr. Reed were still missing, and I knew deep down that we wouldn't find them, not alive anyway. Whatever those creatures had done to them, it wasn't something we could undo. The next few days were a blur of interviews, reports, and sleepless nights. The official explanation was simple. A rockfall had trapped us in an unexplored section of the cave, and exposure to toxic gases had caused hallucinations. That's what they told the media, at least. But I knew the truth. The section of the cave where it all happened was sealed off for safety reasons. Heavy steel gates were installed at the entrance, and warning signs were posted to keep people away. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough, that those creatures were still down there waiting for someone else to stumble into their territory. Rebecca left town a few days later. She said she couldn't stay, not after what she'd seen. I didn't blame her. Allison stayed on for a while but eventually transferred to another park. She didn't say goodbye when she left, but I understood why. As for me, I stayed. Mammoth Cave had been my home for over 20 years, and despite everything that had happened, I couldn't bring myself to leave. Maybe it was guilt. Guilt for not being able to save Turner and Dr. Reed, or maybe it was something else. Something deeper. A few weeks later, I was assigned to a different section of the park, far from the caves where it all happened. It was supposed to be a fresh start, but the nightmares followed me wherever I went. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their pale faces and heard their clicking sounds echoing in my mind. One evening, as I was patrolling a quiet stretch of forest near a small cave entrance, I noticed something that made my blood run cold: claw marks on a tree trunk nearby. They were faint but unmistakable. I stood there for a long time, staring at those marks as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness crept in around me. The forest grew quiet again. Too quiet, and for a moment I thought I heard it, a faint clicking sound carried on the wind. I turned and walked away without looking back, but deep down I knew the truth. This wasn't over. It never would be. My name is Abigail Fleming, and I'm a forest ranger in the Superior National Forest, Minnesota. But I'm not just any ranger. I specialize in forensic botany, studying plants to solve mysteries in the wilderness. It's a job that keeps me close to nature, but also close to memories I wish I could escape. 3 years ago, my daughter Lily disappeared in these very woods. She was only 8. We never found her. I thought I'd learned to live with the emptiness until the call came that morning. It was just before dawn when my radio crackled to life. "Abigail, we've got a situation." Sheriff Luke Donovan's voice came through, tense and hurried. 2 kids are missing from a campsite near Whispering Pines. My heart sank. Whispering Pines wasn't just any part of the forest. It was remote, dense, and steeped in local legends. People said it had a way of swallowing things whole. I grabbed my gear and headed out immediately. When I arrived at the Collins family's campsite, everything felt wrong. Mark and Teresa Collins stood near their tent, looking pale and distant. Their 2 children, Emily, 9, and Jacob, 7, had vanished sometime during the night. "Tell me what happened," I said gently. Mark spoke first. "We went to bed around 10. The kids were in their sleeping bags inside the tent." His voice cracked. "When we woke up this morning, they were gone." I scanned the area carefully. The tent wasn't damaged, no signs of a struggle or forced entry. But then something caught my eye outside the tent. Someone, or something, had arranged the children's toys into a perfect circle on the ground. Pine needles were scattered around them in intricate patterns that looked almost deliberate. Did you do this? I asked. Both parents shook their heads quickly. Teresa was clutching a notebook in her hands, scribbling furiously as if she didn't even hear me. What are you drawing? I asked her softly. She turned the notebook toward me without a word. My stomach churned when I saw it, a strange symbol resembling a cat with antlers. She had drawn it over and over again on every page. Mayim. Sheriff Donovan cut in, his voice firm but kind. We need your help to find your kids. But Teresa didn't respond. She just kept drawing. Something about this wasn't adding up. By mid-morning, we had assembled a search team that included me, Sheriff Donovan, and James Thundercloud, a skilled search and rescue expert from the local Ojibwe community who knew these woods better than anyone else. As we combed through the forest near Whispering Pines, James told us an unsettling story about an old Ojibwe legend, Mishabiju, the underwater panther. According to the tale, Mishabiju was a powerful spirit that lived beneath lakes and rivers. It was said to steal children during certain times of the year to raise them as its own. I wanted to dismiss it as folklore, but then we found something that made my blood run cold. The search dogs had picked up a trail leading toward the lake's edge, but when they reached the waterline, they stopped dead in their tracks and began whimpering uncontrollably. No matter how much coaxing we tried, they refused to go any further. And then we saw them, tiny footprints leading straight into the lake, alongside massive paw prints that didn't belong to any animal I'd ever seen before. That night, as exhaustion set in and hope began to waver, I had a dream, or maybe it was something more than that. In my dream, Lily was standing in the middle of a moonlit forest. She looked exactly as she did 3 years ago, her long brown hair tangled from running through trees. Her big green eyes filled with mischief and wonder. "Mommy," she called out softly. I tried to run toward her, but my feet wouldn't move. Behind her stood other children, pale and silent, with glowing amber eyes that seemed otherworldly. "Lily," I screamed as she turned away and began walking deeper into the woods with the others. When I woke up gasping for air, I couldn't shake one thought from my mind. What if she was trying to tell me something? What if she was still out there? The next day brought more questions than answers. While going through old records of missing persons in the area, I discovered something chilling. Emily and Jacob weren't the first children to vanish near Whispering Pines during this time of year. Over the past 30 years, 5 other kids had disappeared under eerily similar circumstances, all between the ages of 6 and 10. All during the autumn equinox. It couldn't be a coincidence. As we prepared to expand our search deeper into the forest and possibly into the lake itself, I couldn't shake an overwhelming sense of dread. Whatever had taken those children, it wasn't done yet. The lake near Whispering Pines was still and dark, almost like a mirror reflecting the overcast sky. It felt alive somehow, as if it were watching us. Sheriff Donovan had arranged for sonar equipment to scan the lake's depths. What we found made my stomach twist. At the northern edge of the lake, the sonar picked up a series of underwater tunnels, natural caves that had never been mapped before. They stretched deep beneath the forest, twisting and turning like veins. It was the only lead we had, but it wasn't one I wanted to follow. James Thundercloud seemed uneasy too. He stood at the water's edge, staring at the ripples. "This place, it's not right," he said quietly. "The elders warned us about these caves. They say they've been here longer than the forest itself. What do they think is down there?" I asked. He hesitated before answering. "They don't think. They know. Mishabiju lives there." I didn't respond. I didn't believe in legends or spirits, but something about this place made me question everything I thought I knew. As we prepared to search the caves, resistance came from an unexpected source. The town elders themselves. A group of them showed up at the sheriff's office that afternoon, demanding we stop the search immediately. "You're stirring up things that should stay buried," one of them said firmly, his voice trembling with age and fear. Sheriff Donovan tried to reason with them, but they wouldn't budge. "You don't understand," another elder said, her eyes darting nervously toward the forest. "If you go into those caves, you won't come back. Their warnings didn't stop us. We couldn't just walk away, not when 2 children were still missing. That night, I stayed near Whispering Pines to keep watch while the rest of the team rested. The forest was eerily quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. As I sat by my truck, scanning the tree line with my flashlight, I saw something that made my heart race. Far across the lake, on a distant shoreline, I saw silhouettes, small figures moving slowly through the trees. They looked like children. I grabbed my flashlight and ran toward them, calling out their names, Emily, Jacob. But as I got closer, they vanished into thin air. I stood there for a long time, staring into the darkness where they'd been. My hands were shaking. Were my eyes playing tricks on me? Or had I just seen something impossible? The next morning brought another disturbing discovery. James and I were searching deeper into the forest when we noticed something strange about the trees around Whispering Pines. The ancient pines, some hundreds of years old, had carvings etched into their bark. Every single carving was identical to the symbol Teresa Collins had been drawing, a cat-like creature with antlers. "How long have these been here?" I asked James. "Longer than any of us," he replied grimly. We followed the trail of carvings until we reached a clearing near the lake's edge, a spot where no trees grew at all. In the center of the clearing was a pile of rocks arranged in a circle, almost like a shrine. "This isn't natural," James muttered under his breath. I knelt down to examine it and noticed something chilling. Among the rocks were small objects, a child's shoe, a broken doll, a tiny bracelet covered in dirt. "Do you see this?" I asked James. He nodded solemnly. "Offerings." By late afternoon, Sheriff Donovan had brought in a professional diver to explore the underwater tunnels we'd found on sonar. The diver suited up and disappeared beneath the surface while we waited anxiously by the shore. Minutes turned into hours with no word from him. Just as we began to fear something had gone wrong, his voice crackled over our radio. "You're not going to believe this." "What is it?" Donovan asked urgently. "There's an entrance down here, a cave system big enough to walk through," he said breathlessly. "It's strange." "What do you mean, strange?" I asked. "There are markings on the walls, symbols carved into stone," he replied. "And there are signs someone's been living here." I exchanged a worried glance with Donovan and James. Living here? Who or what could possibly survive in such a place? As night fell again, things took an even darker turn. Teresa Collins had been acting strangely ever since her children disappeared, detached and distant, but now her behavior was downright frightening. She refused to eat cooked food and began devouring raw meat with her bare hands. Her voice changed too. She started muttering words in a language none of us recognized. Mark Collins tried to calm her down, but couldn't get through to her anymore. When she wasn't eating or muttering strange words, she was drawing that same symbol over and over again, the cat with antlers. Finally, Mark broke down completely and confessed something none of us were prepared for. "We made a deal," he said through tears. "What kind of deal?" Donovan demanded. Mark hesitated before answering. 3 years ago, Teresa was dying from cancer," he said quietly. "We came here to pray, to ask for help from whatever lives in these woods. And," Donovan pressed him, "it saved her." Mark whispered shakily. "But it wanted something in return." "What did it want?" I asked softly. He looked at me with hollow eyes full of guilt and despair. "Our children." Before any of us could respond, Mark walked into the woods alone, and we never saw him again. The truth was becoming clearer now. Whatever had taken Emily and Jacob wasn't human, and it wasn't going to give them back without a fight. The morning after Mark Collins disappeared, I stood at the edge of the lake staring at the water. It was calm, almost too calm, like it was hiding something beneath its surface. I couldn't stop thinking about what Mark had said, that he and Teresa had made a deal, that they had traded their children. I didn't want to believe it, but everything about this case pointed to something beyond reason. The strange symbols, the carvings in the trees, the underwater caves, it all felt connected. And now, we had no choice but to go down there ourselves. The water level had dropped overnight, revealing a narrow entrance to the cave system along the northern shore. It was dark and jagged, like a mouth waiting to swallow us whole. Sheriff Donovan, James Thundercloud, and I geared up and prepared to enter. None of us spoke much. The air was heavy with tension. As we stepped inside, the light from our flashlights bounced off the damp walls. The cave smelled of wet earth and decay. Strange markings covered the walls, symbols similar to the ones we'd seen on the trees and in Teresa's notebook. They seemed ancient, as if they'd been carved long before humans ever set foot here. The deeper we went, the colder it became. The sound of dripping water echoed around us, making it hard to tell where it was coming from. My heart pounded in my chest as I thought about what might be waiting for us ahead. After what felt like hours of walking, we entered a large chamber that took my breath away, not because it was beautiful, but because it was horrifying. Scattered across the floor were objects that didn't belong here. Children's shoes, toys, clothes, all covered in dirt and moss. Some looked decades old. In the center of the chamber was a crude bed made of woven plant material. Around it were drawings on the walls, childlike sketches of animals, trees, and something else. The creature in the drawings had a feline body with antlers sprouting from its head. Its eyes were large and glowing, just like the ones I'd seen in my dream. "This is where they've been," James whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded silently. My hands were trembling as I picked up a small bracelet from the pile of belongings. It was tarnished and frayed, but I recognized it immediately. It belonged to Lily. My knees buckled as tears filled my eyes. "She was here," I whispered. "My daughter was here." Before I could process what I'd found, a sound echoed through the chamber, a soft shuffling noise coming from one of the tunnels ahead. Sheriff Donovan raised his flashlight and gun at the same time. "Who's there?" he called out. The shuffling grew louder until figures began to emerge from the shadows, small figures with pale skin and glowing amber eyes. They were children. At first I thought they might be Emily and Jacob, but as they stepped closer I realized they weren't entirely human anymore. Their movements were jerky and animal-like. Their teeth were sharp, their nails long and claw-like. They stared at us with unblinking eyes that seemed to see straight into our souls. Among them were other children, some who looked like they'd been here for years or even decades. Their clothes were tattered, their faces blank and expressionless. "Emily? Jacob?" Donovan called out hesitantly. Two of them stepped forward at his voice, a boy and a girl who matched their descriptions perfectly. But they didn't respond to their names. They just stood there watching us silently. Then we heard it, the sound of something massive moving through the tunnels behind them. It was fast and heavy like an animal running on all fours. My flashlight flickered as a shadow passed across the wall, a shadow that didn't make sense. And then we saw it. The creature stepped into view slowly, its antlers scraping against the low ceiling of the cave. Its body was sleek and muscular like a mountain lion's, but its eyes glowed with an unnatural light that made my skin crawl. It moved with an eerie grace, circling us like a predator sizing up its prey. "Mitsubishi," James whispered under his breath. The creature stopped suddenly and stared directly at me. For a moment, everything else faded away. The cave walls, the children, even my fear. All I could feel was its presence pressing down on me like a weight. It didn't attack us. Instead, it seemed to be waiting for something or someone. James stepped forward slowly, his hands raised in surrender. "I know why you're here," he said softly to the creature. "You want them back. What are you doing?" Donovan hissed through clenched teeth. James ignored him and turned to me instead. "And Abigail," he said calmly, "this thing doesn't just take children, it transforms them." "What do you mean?" I asked shakily. He gestured toward the feral children standing behind Mitsubishi. "Look at them. They're not just victims anymore," he explained. "They're becoming part of her." I felt sick to my stomach as his words sank in. These children weren't being killed. They were being changed into something else entirely. Guardians of this forest, just like her. James took another step toward Mitsubishi before speaking again. "You don't need more children," he said firmly. "Take me instead." "No," I shouted instinctively. But James turned back toward me with a sad smile on his face. "I'm dying anyway," he said quietly. "Cancer's already taken everything from me. This is my chance to give something back." Before I could stop him, James knelt down in front of Mitsubishi and bowed his head in submission. For a moment, nothing happened, and then everything did. The creature let out an ear-piercing roar that shook the entire cave as its glowing eyes locked onto James's trembling form. But then, it stopped. Mitsubishi turned its gaze back toward me instead. And that's when I realized what it really wanted, not James, but more children, whose spirits could still be molded into its own image. The cave was silent, except for the sound of my own breathing. Mitsubishi stood there, towering over us, its glowing amber eyes fixed on me. I could feel its presence deep in my chest, like it was pulling at something inside me. The feral children gathered around it, watching me with the same unblinking gaze. I didn't know what to do. My hands were shaking, my mind racing. But then, something shifted, something I couldn't explain. It wasn't fear anymore. It was understanding. This creature wasn't just a monster, it was a mother. I stepped forward slowly, ignoring Donovan's whispered protests behind me. Mitsubishi didn't move as I approached. It just watched me with those ancient eyes that seemed to hold centuries of pain and loss. "I know why you're doing this," I said softly, my voice trembling but steady. "You're protecting them." The creature tilted its head slightly, as if it understood me. And then, without warning, it reached out, not physically, but mentally. I felt its presence in my mind, like a flood of memories rushing in all at once. Images flashed before me, a vast forest untouched by humans, filled with creatures like Mitsubishi, powerful guardians of the land. But over time, they began to disappear, hunted and driven out by people who didn't understand them. Mitsubishi was the last of her kind, alone and desperate to preserve her legacy. She had found a way to survive by creating new guardians, children whose spirits were pure enough to transform into something greater. She wasn't killing them. She was saving them in her own way. And then I saw her, Lily. Her face appeared in my mind like a memory I'd buried too deep to find on my own. She looked just as she had in my dream, wild and free, her green eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. "She's here," I whispered aloud. Mitsubishi didn't respond, but I could feel the truth in my heart. Lily hadn't been taken by this creature. She had died in the forest 3 years ago. But somehow, Mitsubishi had preserved her spirit within herself, keeping her safe from the darkness that had claimed so many others. Tears streamed down my face as I realized what this meant. Lily wasn't coming back, not as the little girl I'd lost, but she wasn't gone either. She was part of something bigger now, something eternal. Mitsubishi offered me something then, a choice. Before she disappeared completely, Mitsubishi gave me one final gift, a brief glimpse of Lily's spirit glowing softly within her amber eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give me closure. As we left the caves and returned to the surface with Emily and Jacob in tow, I felt lighter somehow. Not because everything was okay now, it wasn't. But because I finally understood that some things couldn't be fixed or undone. They could only be accepted. The morning light felt different as we emerged from the caves. Emily and Jacob walked beside us, quiet and dazed but alive. Their amber eyes had faded back to normal, though there was something about them, something subtle that had changed forever.